The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. Any rebroadcast, reproduction, or other use of this broadcast or podcast without the express written consent of Spaced Out Radio or Spaced Out Radio Limited is strictly prohibited. Listener discretion is advised. Are you experienced?
Stop right there!
From high atop the mountains of British Columbia to you listening around the world, this is Spaced Out Radio with host Dave Scott.
They let us play with all our toys, they let us think that we're big boys, they let us make the louder noise, but we're in the world. They let us think we're Superman.
You can follow us on our website, spacedoutradio.com, on iTunes and TuneIn. Follow Dave on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio, on Facebook at Spaced Out Radio Show, or on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show.
I try to act so cool, but you know I'm just a fool for you. I will stop till I reach the top just to be there with you.
Dave, oh Dave, are you playing with Bigfoot and aliens again?
Dad, you gotta stop haunting the ghost. It's scaring them.
All right, seriously, put down the pointy sticks.
Oh, the deeper I fall.
Okay! Game on! Game on! Game on!
The password is...
All right.
Buckle up, space travelers. It's time to go for a ride on Spaced Out Radio. Mr. Bumblefoot, Dave is ready for liftoff.
I try to act so cool, but you know I'm just a fool for you.
Seriously, Dave? Really? Aren't you a little old for a tinfoil hat?
Hello, Toby. Bye-bye. Love you. Bye-bye.
Please take your seat about all. Grab up the entrance. It's time for takeoff. Start. 2, 1. Boost to ignition and lift off.
I'm such a lucky guy, 'cause after all this time, it's like the deeper I go, the deeper I fall. The deeper I go, the deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Spaced Out Radio. Tonight I am your host, Dave Scott, and it's great to have you along for the ride on this Thursday, September 28th, Friday, September 29th. If you're on the East Coast or across the pond, Hope you had a great day and night as we are live right here in the Great White North on top of the mountains of central British Columbia as we are here for your listening needs 7 days a week. We welcome in everyone listening in on WQEE 99 Rock the Key down in Noonan, Georgia, home of The Walking Dead. We are live as well on the United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM in New Orleans and over 160 countries around the world. We are also live at spacedoutradio.com, Spreaker, KTLK, The Fringe FM, Renegade Talk Radio out of Las Vegas, the High Plains Talk Radio Network, and if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. Like our music, get your horns up for Mr. Ron Bumblefoot THAL, formerly of Guns N' Roses, currently of Art of Anarchy and Sons of Apollo. Bumblefoot is the official music of Spaced Out Radio. Now, if you're on social media, you can follow us on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, you can follow me at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. Listen to us on iHeartRadio in the United States. TalkStream Live. Tune us in on TuneIn. Download and subscribe to our shows from iTunes. Our website is spacedoutradio.com. Now, if you want to take part in this show, you got to do me a favor because we don't take phone calls around here, but you can chat with us. And I'll take your questions in the chat rooms, either on Revolution Radio, Spreaker, the UPRN chat room, or on Facebook. You got to join up on the SOR Space Travelers Club. Or if you're on Twitter, use the hashtag Spaced Out Radio. I will get to your questions and comments in there as well. Now, if you head to our website for $5 a month, you can become an SOR Space Traveler, and you can also shop at our Spaced Out Radio store. Read our news section, The Encounter Online. Read up on my latest blog. If you've had an experience you can't explain, fill out an SOR Sightlines report, and you can also catch some video footage from Tim Doyle's UFO Seekers and Leslie Mitchell Clark's Contact TV. Religion and religious icons are a really touchy subject around the show like we have, but sometimes the mystery that surrounds such topics falls perfectly into our genre. Take, for instance, the Shroud of Turin. The legendary shroud is owned by the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church. The shroud is kept in the Royal Chapel of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. The Catholic Church has neither formally endorsed nor rejected the shroud, but in 1958, Pope Pius XII approved of the image in the association with the devotion to the Holy Face of Jesus. Pope John Paul II called the shroud a mirror of the gospel. So why not confirm whether or not it is the image of the body of the Son of God left behind after his resurrection? J.R. Watts is a researcher on the shroud. He's looked deep into both the shroud and biblical texts to find some interesting patterns intertwining the two. His website is shroudcodes.com. J.R. Watts, all the way from New York, thank you so much for being on Spaced Out Radio tonight. How are you, my friend?
Okay, Dave, how are you?
I am very good, very good. You know, this is one of these topics that we're going to be hitting tonight that absolutely blows my mind because there are so many questions both to the authenticity, to science, and to the fact that the Roman Catholic Church will neither confirm nor deny whether or not it is that of Jesus Christ. So we can go in a lot of different directions tonight, but first let's learn a little bit about you.
Okay. Can I ask you, is it all right if I have you on speakerphone, or should I take you off speakerphone?
Oh, you're sounding great right now. You're sounding great.
Okay, fine. All right. I'm a former government investigator, intelligence analyst, and code breaker for over 25 years. I also worked for government military contractors for a couple of years as well with encryption technology. That's how my interest in secret codes and code breaking began in the 1990s, working on these government projects. And I was a avid researcher where the Shroud of Turin was concerned. I had researched the Shroud as best as I could for about 25 years. And I was also, I guess, what you might call an evangelical Christian. I wasn't really a Catholic, but I wasn't much of a churchgoer, so and I didn't know the Bible like the back of my hand. So it's like, I guess I'm a lot like many other people who, looked for salvation and got interested in the Bible later on in life, as opposed to early on.
So growing up in a really non-religious platform, how did you all of a sudden find the interest in the Shroud of Turin?
The first recollection I have of the Shroud was in 1988 when news reports in October of 1988 began to circulate on TV and on the radio and in the newspaper that the Shroud had been carbon dated by several scientists in Britain and Australia and Arizona, and that they came to the conclusion that the Shroud was no older than from the late 12th century, early 13th century, so they branded it a medieval forgery. They claimed it was nothing more than a painting that had been whipped, which had been, they actually said that pig's blood had been thrown on it to simulate human blood. They stooped that low to say such a thing, and that was by Professor Richard Hall, I believe his name was. He was the head of the carbon dating project team. Now, a lot of people don't realize this. They had their own agenda, the carbon dating team. These were college professors from Britain who hatched this scheme to debunk religion through science. And they wanted to use the Shroud of Turin as their target. They were proponents of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the origin of species. They taught those subjects on the college campuses at the university level. These were people also who were associated with the British Museum, anthropology experts, natural history experts, and that type of thing. So evolution, the theory of evolution, was part and parcel in their bag of tricks. Why the Vatican allowed them to extract a couple of inches of material from the Shroud is anyone's guess. You really have to wonder why they would even allow it. However, the only thing that they extracted from that cloth was a section that had been repaired in the 15th century. It had been rewoven, and new patches of cloth were sewn over the holes that were burnt through the material by a fire 2 years earlier in the year 1532. And so that fire had almost destroyed the Shroud. It left scorch marks and singe marks and out-and-out holes in the Shroud from top to bottom, from one side to the other. Fortunately, the image of Jesus' face and his hands with the marks of crucifixion and his feet with the nail prints in his feet from being crucified, and most of his bodily image was unscathed by the scorch marks. The scorch marks affected the shoulder areas, the upper arm areas, and the outer portions of his legs, both of his legs. Other than that, the rest of his image is intact on the Shroud. And actually, the scorch marks that were left, you could actually see it from top to bottom. It almost looks like the image of flames of fire that was burning through the linen cloth of the Shroud. And in fact, that's what had happened. But to look at the Shroud, the thing about the Shroud is this. In 1898, the first photographs of the Shroud were taken by an Italian photographer, Secondo Pia was his name. He was actually a lawyer who was also a photographer. And they were having some kind of a Shroud conference in 1898 in Italy. And so for the occasion, they decided they were going to photograph the Shroud for the first time ever in history, not realizing that the Shroud itself is history's first photograph that was taken, more or less, by miraculous means in the tomb of Jesus in the first century. Because that's what we see on the linen cloth, the image of Jesus, what Paul the Apostle wrote as part of his shroud codes, the image of the invisible God. Now, if you stop right then and there and ask, what do you mean when you say the image of the invisible God? I ask myself, how can an image be invisible if it's an image? It's a contradiction in terms. It doesn't make sense. But you have to understand what Paul was writing in actuality. That was a shroud code. He was cryptically alluding to Jesus' image on the shroud. Not only that, his invisible image on the shroud, because the shroud contains, it's embedded with an invisible image of Jesus, far more anatomically detailed than what we see in the visible image on the exterior of the shroud. The exterior of the shroud looks like the ghost of a man. It looks like a spectral image, a shadowy silhouette figure of a man. It's a tan color, the shroud, a light tan color. It's a very faint tan color. In fact, it's almost the color of dried yolk. That's how faint it is. In fact, some of Paul's shroud codes refer to it as the yoke fellow. So what do we see on the shroud? The image of a man or a fellow. And what color is the shroud? It's like the color of a dried yolk, which darkens when it's dried. When you think of egg yolk, you think of something that's yellow. However, when it's if you were to crack an egg on a sidewalk and it dried with time, especially if it's warm weather out or humidity, and it dries, it darkens in color. So I believe that the term yoke fellow that Paul used 2 or 3 times in his epistles absolutely made no sense at all unless you factor in the notion that it was a shroud code and that he was alluding to the color tone of the material itself and the image of a man on there or a fellow. But that's just one example. There's so many examples of these shroud codes that only a code breaker could have deciphered. In other words, these codes in the New Testament, written by the disciples of Jesus, and there are hundreds of them. We've been looking at these codes for thousands of years without realizing it. Every time you read the New Testament, you've actually seen a network, a secret networks of silent shroud codes. In other words, they don't advertise themselves as being codes about the shroud, because if they did, then they wouldn't be secret codes. But they had to be secret codes, because if they weren't secretly embedded within the scriptures through an interlooping of words mixed with codes that were part of the gospel narratives about the recounting of Jesus' life, if we didn't see that, then they wouldn't even be secret codes. If they just wrote a book about the shroud, the disciples, you couldn't even consider them to be secret codes or shroud codes. It would be a separate book about the shroud. The amazing thing is, I detected early on that someone in the first century had conducted an experiment, and that experiment was to see if secret codes, and not just secret codes individually, but patterns of secret codes, could be embedded in the scriptures and be embedded in such a way that they wouldn't be recognized as being cryptic data about the shroud. You got to understand that the Jewish high priest who instigated Jesus' crucifixion and his kangaroo court, they were always sending spies into the disciples' camp. So whenever they had meetings with new converts to Christianity, the disciples had to be very leery about spies being sent in from the Herod's temple, from the court of Herod, King Herod, from the Jewish high priests, and also from the Roman Empire, from Pontius Pilate's spies. They were trying to look for evidence to use against the disciples in order to eliminate them and execute them as quickly as possible before Christianity ever had a chance to be taken as a serious religion and as a new movement but also to wipe out the memory of Jesus of Nazareth. If they had realized that these individual letters and Gospels would one day be combined into one book called the New Testament, and that this book contained a secret network of shroud codes, they would have killed these guys right on the spot before they ever had a chance to finish writing these Gospels. Whether or not the Jewish high priest, and whether or not King Herod, who was like a rogue king, who was a corrupt king, and whether or not Pontius Pilate and the officials of the Roman Empire, whether or not they suspected the existence of the shroud, whether or not they knew or heard rumor of the image of Jesus being transferred onto the burial cloth that we call the Shroud of Turin these days, history doesn't tell us that. But the shroud codes that the disciples wrote indicate to us that that might have been the case, that a secret search and seizure mission might have been undertaken by their enemies, the enemies of the disciples, to search for the shroud, to destroy it. And certainly, they would have grilled the disciples and their friends and family members for any statements they could have gotten out of them that would have amounted to being confessions about their knowledge of the shroud, about Jesus' image on the shroud. It would have been probably the last sign of the last miraculous sign that Jesus left in a visual way, his image on that burial linen cloth. It would have been something that they would not have wanted to be around. They would have set it on fire. They would have torn it apart. They would have done anything they could to wipe it out. So, fortunately, they didn't realize that, I don't think they did. I don't think that they realized that the disciples used ancient forms of cryptology to blend clues and hints and symbolic signs about the shroud into the Gospels and Epistles in the New Testament. Don't forget, Jesus' disciples were fishermen for the most part. So one was a tax collector. Paul was a tent maker. And he also had a lot of Jewish religious training. And so these guys, especially the fishermen, were not highly educated. So it's not like they went to a school for spies, or maybe they did. Somebody taught them a basic form of encryption, which we would call, in the intelligence field, we would call that linguistic codes. Linguistic means the language or the syntax of language, how you can hide codes in a body of text, whether it's a page of text or a whole book or a gospel, hide codes effectively by submerging them into other words, or so these other words that surround them are not codes about the shroud, but yet they serve to recount the life of Jesus in the New Testament. But some of those words were shroud codes. Sometimes they appear as in certain verses, they appear as one or two words. Sometimes it's a full verse surrounded by other verses that don't have any shroud codes. But by and by, from what I was able to decipher, more so than not, the majority of verses in the New Testament, I decoded hints and signs and symbols and clues about the shroud in a variety of ways. The surface reading of the Bible, a code breaker would call that the plain text. The plain text is the Bible narrative that you would normally read whenever you read the Bible. But the shroud codes compose a ciphertext. There is a hidden ciphertext that's camouflaged in the New Testament. The ciphertext is a crypto system made or composed of cryptograms about the shroud. You've heard of the term in the 20th century the term telegram was a common term in the first half of the 20th century. So instead of telegrams, and what we see in the New Testament are cryptograms about the Shroud. This form of secret writing about the Shroud, it was like an invisible form of Morse code that evaded the eyes of the high priests. It evaded the eyes of King Herod and his men. It evaded the eyes of the Roman Empire and Pontius Pilate. Anyone who tried to hijack copies of the Gospels, and another thing to remember is anytime they wrote the Gospels and the epistles in the New Testament, they made numerous copies to distribute all over the Middle East. And so some of these copies were hijacked by the enemies of the disciples, and they were looking for evidence against them. So they had to write what I call a poetic masquerade in prose. It was a poetic license that allowed the disciples to blend shroud codes into their Gospels. That now you could call them the encoders, because that's what they were in actuality. They were the disciples, but their hidden role as the secret agents of the Shroud also meant that they were also the encoders. And I'll give you an example. Even in the Old Testament, the prophets of the Old Testament who wrote prophecies about the end of days, about the last days, or prophecies about the birth of Jesus and his life, prophecies about his crucifixion and death and resurrection. And these prophecies were written as a poetic masquerade in prose. They don't stand out as being actual prophecies. That's why a lot of religious Jews in Jesus' time did not understand these Old Testament verses that turned out to be ancient prophecies about Jesus. They were confused about these, or they mistook these prophecies to mean something else altogether, instead of alluding to Jesus and his mission on earth. I'll give you an example. In Psalm 22, David's writing as though he were Jesus suffering on the cross. He writes in the first person as a man who's being crucified. In David's lifetime, in the Old Testament, crucifixion hadn't even been invented as a form of punishment. And so when he wrote Psalm 22, you don't see the word crucifixion, but you don't have to. What he described physically, the forensic signs of it, of Jesus' crucifixion, are all in the words in Psalm 22. About my limbs are all out of joint, for an example. That is referencing a man that's hanging by his hands or by his wrists. Jesus was nailed through the upper hands, the back of his upper hands, and then the nails the exit wounds for the nails were in the wrists. Actually, the nails were nailed in the upper hands, and they exited the wrist, but the wrists were right next to the wood of the crossbeam of his cross. Virtually every artist has gotten, over the years, has gotten it wrong. Artists who painted Jesus on the cross have wrongly painted the nail wounds in the middle of the palms of his hands, and that's not the way they crucified people. The weight of the body would have never had held the person's body to the cross if the hands would have ripped apart through the nail. Granted, sometimes they also tied people's arms to the cross, but the thing was, if you could nail a person by their hands or their wrists to a cross, then it's not rope that's keeping them suspended to the cross. It's their own body weight, but their own body weight is killing them. And also, Jesus' arms were crucified straight up. You know, like you're being robbed by a man with a gun, and he says, stick him up. Your arms go straight up in the air, okay? Artists have gotten it wrong as far as the arm position of Jesus is on the cross. They make it look like a T shape. That wasn't the case. And we know that by the blood trails of his the blood that's coming out of the nail prints of his wrists. They drip down his arm to his elbow, at an angle that could never have been if he was crucified, if his arms were in a T shape from left to right on the cross. So, that's another thing that artists have gotten wrong. We see the evidence of that in the Shroud. But look at it this way. If you were one of Jesus' disciples, you knew about the Shroud, you had the Shroud, you couldn't dare show it in public, at least not with your enemies around to see, because they wouldn't, 5 minutes would not go by before you got arrested and beaten and thrown in jail and the Shroud got ripped up. So you couldn't take a chance of doing it in public. But you might take a chance behind closed doors to small select groups of people, one town at a time, one city at a time. And so the Shroud was smuggled here and there. I liken it to a underground Shroud railroad, okay? Granted, there was no such thing as a railroad in the first century, but there were smuggling routes and for contraband. And the Shroud would have certainly been considered contraband in the first century. If you would have been caught with it, you would have been dead. And so the last thing they did was write about it openly in the New Testament. I get amazed sometimes, Dave, when I hear Catholic priests and clergy from other Christian denominations simply shrug their shoulders and say, gee, we just don't know about the Shroud because the disciples didn't write about it. It's not written about in the New Testament. And they don't stop to consider what I just told you about the dangers, the double-edged sword that the Shroud posed to the disciples' safety. And so what they had to do was write their Shroud codes in the form of symbolic references, disguised metaphors, and phonetic ciphers. Paul, the apostle, even encoded the dimensions, the length of the Shroud and the width of the Shroud in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 chapter 12 and chapter 13. And I found this well over a year ago in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, particularly in verse 3, you see the word 14. And then if you skip a couple of words, you see the words to the third. So if you take the words that are not codes out of the equation, then what you get, the code is this, 14 to the third. Now, we know for a fact the Shroud of Turin is 14 feet, 3 inches long. And so if I told you 14 to the third, that is a cryptic way. It is a way a secret agent would have written a code. It is a way a code breaker would have deciphered it. It's a way that a code maker or a cryptographer would have written it. And then I looked very hard for the width of the Shroud. I knew there had to be a code about the width of the Shroud in the same chapter or an adjacent chapter in 2 Corinthians. I said it wouldn't make sense for Paul to write a code about the length of the Shroud and not include the width of the Shroud. We know for a fact the width of the Shroud is 3 feet 5 inches wide. That's an established fact. Now, I was thrown off. When I searched for this code, I couldn't find it. And I found it by accident this past June when I took a second look at Corinthians, because I'm doing a press conference next week in New York City about the discovery of the Shroud codes and my book, Shroud Codes in the Bible. Doing a press conference with a PowerPoint on October 4th. And in that PowerPoint, I'm going to show these codes. The width of the Shroud is encoded in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1, with the words are this: a third, skip a couple of words, a third, then he wrote 2 or 3. And this is what threw me, that part, that whole section. I was looking for the word 3. I should have realized that a third would have also cryptically signified the number 3, to signify 3 feet. But what further threw me off when I was writing my book was the last part of that code, 2 or 3. Now, he wrote it out alphabetically, 2 or 3. The word or, O-R, really was a substitute cipher for a plus sign. If you add 2 and 3 together, you're going to get 5. Now, it's ingenious of Paul to have written it that way, to have encoded it that way, but that's the whole crux of the matter. It's a code. A third, 2 or 3, or 2 plus 3. Or he could have said 2 and 3, but more effectively, I think it would have been 2 plus 3. So I believe that the shroud was going to be smuggled to the church at Corinth, and the Corinthians were expecting it. They were expecting to see it in secrecy, in privacy. And Paul wanted to make sure that they knew its exact size and dimensions. And that's what it is. Some people will argue that, well, you know, the original shroud was not as wide as it is today, or it wasn't as long as it is today. That it was sewn onto another cloth. But I got to tell you something. They don't know for a fact, and I'm talking about the shroud experts out there. They don't know if the shroud had been sewn onto a backing cloth that was larger in the 1st century. That could have been a possibility. And the reason for that would have been to maintain its structural integrity. Because remember, it's a cloth. It's a very fine linen cloth. It's very thin. It's about as thin as a bed sheet. No, thicker than that. It's almost like cheesecloth. So it's very fragile cloth. It's well possible that it could have been sewn onto a larger cloth, because maybe the edges got frayed. I mean, they certainly got frayed with time. We know that. And from various fires that people tried to set it on fire over the years. But whatever the case, these shroud codes, I believe, were destined to be decoded in the 21st century. I don't think that they could have been decoded in any age prior to our age that we now live in. I know I've read articles on the internet that Isaac Newton had tried to search for codes about the shroud, that Nostradamus had tried to search for codes about the shroud, because you have to understand something. In the lifetime of Nostradamus, and then later on Sir Isaac Newton, they were well aware of the shroud's existence, because by then it was no secret. By then it was in the custodialship of the Catholic Church, and it had been in France for a couple hundred years, and then it was brought to Italy, to northern Italy, in the city of Turin, where it came to get its nickname, the Shroud of Turin. It really, in actuality, it should be called the Shroud of Jesus Christ, or the Shroud of the Messiah.
Let me interrupt you there, because you've said so much, and I want to just get some reaction from you. You are convinced that even though carbon dating dated the shroud back to around 1358, that it is actually the image of Jesus Christ on the shroud.
They carbon dated. They carbon dated the wrong part of that cloth. They carbon dated a section in that cloth. It was only a couple inches long and a couple inches wide. Maybe, I don't know. It might have been about 3 or 4 or 5 inches long. They carbon dated that section that had been reweaved in the 15th century with linen cloth from the 15th century woven into the surviving cloth of the 1st century. And so what they did was they got a haywire carbon dating for the samples that they extracted from the cloth. But not only that, they were paid $1.5 million. I'm talking about these British professors. Edward Hall. I said his name was Richard Hall before. I'm mistaken. It's Edward Hall. Edward Hall, Michael Tite, Professor Michael Tite, Professor Robert Hedges. They were all British college professors in the 1970s who were the proponents of carbon dating. Now, carbon dating was a brand new form of scientific testing in the 1970s. In fact, it's more theoretical than anything else. It's all based on theory, set forth by atheist, Darwinian evolutionists. And that's a fact. But the fact also remains that they admitted that they were paid $1.5 million, not necessarily to carbon date the shroud to find out its true age. They were paid $1.5 million by anonymous donors to debunk the shroud so that they could claim that it was a forgery from the Middle Ages. So do you think that they would then go out and look for a true date for the age of it with $1.5 million waiting to be grabbed by them? No. In fact, Professor Edward Hall earned about $100,000 or $150,000 from the British Broadcasting Corporation for the rights, the TV rights to his so-called story about his participation in this scandal of the carbon dating of the shroud. Now, fast forward to 2005, physicist Ray Rogers from the Los Alamos laboratories, National Laboratories in New Mexico, where they did the atomic bomb testing in the 1940s, Rogers had existing samples of the shroud that they did not carbon date in 1988. Carbon dating came about in the 1970s. 10 years later, they carbon dated in 1988. They didn't tell the world that they were paid $1.5 million to do it, to debunk the shroud, and they didn't tell the world that they purposely selected a part of the shroud that had been rewoven. They knew, they must have known, they're not stupid, they're scientists. They had to have known they were going to get a date that was going to be favorable to their debunking of the shroud. And this is with nobody double-checking their results. They had nobody watching their back. They violated every protocol that they agreed with the Vatican to abide by. They all gathered together like vultures in Turin, Italy, one night, late at night, in 1988, to extract this small sample from the shroud. And they looked like a bunch of butchers. And you could see the looks on their faces. The Italian clergy who were responsible for this miscarriage of justice was standing right next to them. I kind of suspect somebody got paid off, under the table for allowing this to happen. But, that's just speculation on my part. There had to have been motivation for somebody allowing this. Unfortunately, it was allowed to take place, and they violated the protocols. They went into a private room, and they dissected that section of cloth. Now, this is without the eyes of the Italian priests watching them. They were supposed to watch them, go into the room with them to make sure there was no switch of material, just in case they had that idea of switching cloth, because they did have their hands on other material similar to the shroud that was a lot older from the Middle Ages. They could have easily switched it. So there's a lot of reasons for not believing them. But Ray Rogers, the physicist in 2005, proved that what they carbon dated was a sample taken from a repair job from the 15th century. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that it was not a proper form of testing. If they were going to test it from a part of the shroud that was not part of a repair job, that did not have parts of or particles of new cloth that was sewn in the 15th century. Now, you know that, I'll tell you one thing, and I say this in my book about the shroud codes. There's a parable by Jesus that was a prophecy of this very thing, this miscarriage of justice with the carbon dating. Jesus, it's a well-known parable by Jesus, the parable of the new cloth, patch of new cloth. Okay, it's in the New Testament. It's in a few of the Gospels. Now, Jesus gave advice against sewing on patches of new cloth on any kind of a linen cloth or article of clothing that might have a tear or a rip. He advised against it because he said, well, the new cloth would never mesh correctly with the old cloth, and it'll just make the hole bigger. Now, none of this makes sense. Jesus didn't suddenly go into upholstery tips, and furthermore, in those days, that's what they did. There was a rip or a hole in an article of clothing. You didn't throw the jacket out. You didn't throw the pants out. You got your wife or your mother to mend it or to darn it. And they would do that. They would sew on new patches of cloth because that's the only way to preserve something in those days. They didn't go down to Kmart and get something new. So you had to realize that these shroud codes are written in a deceptive way that was designed to fool the eyes of the Jewish high priests and the Roman Empire so that they would not see signs of the shroud in the New Testament. That said, you might be a little confused about what I just said about the parable of the new cloth. I say it was a prophecy. It was a shroud prophecy. In addition to being a shroud code, it was a prophecy about what would happen with the shroud 15 centuries later when a group of nuns in France were assigned to repair the burn holes and the scorch marks after the fire in 1532, and they did that with new cloth. Now, the French in those days, in the Middle Ages, they had an intricate way of saving textiles and fabrics and cloth and clothing that had been damaged or burned. In fact, they were the experts at it in Europe. They had developed a invisible form of reweaving with transparent fiber that they used to sew and thread new patches of cloth. And now, lots of times, what they did, from what I understand, the patches were dyed a certain color to match the color of the shroud. So it wouldn't look like a white piece of cloth that had been sewn onto the shroud, because the shroud was tan color. So they even dyed the cloth, and this is up and down the shroud. It's not just one. It's not just a section that was carbonated. All the repair jobs done to the shroud you could see on the internet where it's been repaired, and they were dyed the same color as the shroud. So and that's what they did. They probably did that with everything they repaired back then.
But do you believe, JR, that the shroud is that of Jesus Christ?
I believe it because the shroud codes, the hundreds of shroud codes I deciphered in the New Testament confirm it. And I also was able to decode patterns of cryptic codes in the Old Testament about the shroud. Now, this should come as no shock to people, although some people wonder, they scratch their heads, well, how could there be codes about the shroud in the Old Testament if it was a relic from the first century? You have to realize something, that God has inspired the writing of the Bible. The Bible originates from another dimension. The Bible itself states that it's encoded with secrets, secrets that will one day be decoded or unsealed as we approach the end of time, time as we know it anyway, as we approach the return of the Messiah. Many codes, many secrets will be revealed from the Bible. They'll be unsealed by the power of God and by the power of Christ. And if you look at Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 12, the archangel Gabriel allows Daniel to see visions of the last days, and he gives him premonitions, information about the last days. And part of that information was that all these prophecies and premonitions about the last days, about events that would happen, were going to be sealed in the book. He didn't say it would be sealed in the Bible, it would be sealed in your book, Daniel, in the book of Daniel, or it would be sealed in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Old Testament as a whole. He just said the book. That's what Gabriel said. Now, he could only have meant one book, and that's the Bible. And so Daniel chapter 12 correlates to Revelation chapter 5. In Revelation chapter 5, John the disciple wrote that the earth was, no one on earth, no man on earth could be found who is worthy to unseal the codes from the Bible. They couldn't do it alone by themselves. Some had tried without prayer, without depending on God for help and guidance and inspiration. And so Revelation 12 shows us that the Lamb, meaning Jesus, walks up to the throne of God, and God hands him a scroll with 7 seals. And only Jesus could break those seals, those 7 seals. And as he does, one after another, the secrets of the Bible are unsealed on earth. And prophecy begins to become fulfilled, one seal after another. Now, a certain amount of years might go by in between seals being broken and the secrets being unsealed on earth and the prophecies coming true. It's not like a 90-minute movie where everything happens in 90 minutes. From my experience, any man, whether he's a code breaker, a Christian, or a religious Jew, whether he's a computer scientist or a mathematician or a rabbi, who has searched for these codes, the Torah code, the Bible code, the Shroud codes, I don't think any of them have been able to do it apart from the power of God helping them. This took divine inspiration. Myself, I've always said this, Dave, that if anyone thinks I broke these Shroud codes on my own, that I cracked these codes by myself, you better think twice. I had prayed to God to help me, that if any codes existed about the Shroud in the Bible, to help me decode them. Fortunately for me, I also happen to have experience as a code breaker for many years and a government investigator and an intelligence analyst. So I was able to use those skills I learned working for the government to that end, to decipher. And I used the same techniques to decode the Shroud codes in the Bible, the same code-breaking techniques that the CIA and the NSA used, the National Security Agency, the same methods that the Israeli Mossad uses, and the same techniques of code breaking that the British M16 use whenever they crack codes, whether they be terrorist codes or military codes or whatever. And I'm talking about processes known as cluster analysis, data mining, pattern recognition, quantitative data analysis, detection of graphical deception, deductive logic, frequency analysis. It's also the study of word camouflage. A lot of my research was also based on my years of study of word camouflaging. And that's how you hide secret codes in a given text. Like in World War I, World War II, the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, codes were always passed from secret agent to secret agent in code. They were encrypted. And sometimes they were written down, they had newspapers made. And newspapers weren't actually newspapers, but they looked like newspapers, and inside were codes. And there had to be a code book to decipher them. So my book, The Shroud Codes in the Bible, is also like a code book. It shows you, even on the front cover of my book, which I'm going to send you a copy of up there in Canada, it shows you the codes of the Old Testament about the Shroud, also combined with the codes of the New Testament about the Shroud. The Shroud contains a double exposure image of Jesus that we discussed before. One you see on the outside, it looks like a specter of a man. Looks like a ghost. And this is probably why they wrote the word Holy Ghost so often in the New Testament, because this is what they saw in the Shroud, the holy image of Jesus, which looked like a ghost to them. However, they also saw that holographic image that's hidden beneath that surface image. And that holographic image is a secondary image of Jesus, which you can't see with the naked eye unless Jesus allows you to, or unless you happen to have a camera and you take a picture of it. These days in the 21st century, it's all over the internet, so we take it for granted. We don't, we see it without having to say a prayer. We see it without having to take a picture of it, because many people, many photographers, thousands of them have taken pictures of the shroud over the years. All right, ever since photography, I was going to say ever since photography was invented, but the truth of the matter was, photography was invented about 30 years before the year 1898. It was really pre-Civil War. So the Vatican waited about 30 or 40 years before they decided to have pictures of the shroud taken, which is an amazing thing that they waited so long. But they did. And once they developed the pictures, the negative plates from those photographs, this other image, this alternative image, appeared in the negative. It was a more anatomically detailed image of Jesus that you could see in grayscale. Now, this image is not, strangely, this image is not the same light tan color that you see.
JR, I'm going to cut you off right there because we are going to step out for a commercial break here momentarily, and I don't want you to get caught up on that. J.R. Watts is our guest tonight on Spaced Out Radio. We're into a great conversation about the Shroud of Turin. If you want to check out JR's website, it is shroudcodes.com. Once again, that is shroudcodes.com. I highly suggest you check it out. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott. We'll be back right after this break.
365 days a year, we're in the field, investigating UFO sightings, talking to alien abductees, and visiting secret military locations like Area 51. We're UFO Seekers, official partner of Spaced Out Radio. Follow our daily search for the truth at ufoseekers.com or like us on social media. Catch us on Spaced Out Radio every third Monday of the month as we discuss Area 51, UFOs, and more. And also, don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube.
From coast to coast to coast, Blacklight Uncharted is taking on the paranormal across Canada. From ghostly hauntings to the UFOs flying above in conjunction with MUFON Canada, they're closely investigating what's going on in the northern skies and checking out the apparitions that walk among us. Check out our videos right here at spacedoutradio.com. We want to know your thoughts, we want to hear your experiences, and we want you to share your stories. The answers are out there, and we intend to find them.
Would you like to become one of our space travelers? All you have to do is click on the Space Travelers icon at spacedoutradio.com. For only $5 a month, you can get access to some great prizes, as well as private monthly shows, newsletters, and a members-only section on our website. Become a space traveler today.
It's paranormal news at its finest. Welcome to The Encounter. At spaceoutradio.com, The Encounter online is SOR's trusted news source for everything weird and strange going on around the world. This is news editor Eric Markham. Our team of journalists are scouring the planet for those strange stories that rarely make the mainstream. No fear-mongering or fake news here. Head over to spaceoutradio.com and encounter The Encounter.
Want to learn more about aliens, cover-ups, conspiracies, cryptids, and the paranormal? All you have to do is tune in S4 as we take over the Spaced Out Radio night, starting at midnight Pacific, 3 a.m. Eastern, each and every Saturday night, right after Spaced Out Saturdays. Hi there, this is Eric Cooper from Forest Moon Paranormal. Join me, Corey Ruiz, and friends as we discuss the hot topics of the night. It's fun, entertaining, and as dark as the night. Find us at spacedoutradio.com.
Hey, this is Canadian Paranormal Investigator Mike Moore. The third Wednesday of every month, I'll be teaming up with Dave Scott to bring you Ghosts of the Great White North. Each month, we will bring on guests from across Canada to discuss their ghostly encounters. Canada is a paranormal hotbed with stories you've never heard, so we're going to bring them to you. So get comfy on your Chesterfield, grab a donut, and join us, eh?
Are you an experiencer? Have you had run-ins with strange creatures you can't explain? ETs, Dogman, Bigfoot, werewolves? They're enough to scare the daylights out of anyone. Hi there, I'm Butch Witkowski from your 4-Cop. And on the last Monday of every month, you can listen to me and the host, Dave Scott, talk about the weird and the strange being reported on Spaced Out Radio. I'm going to bring my investigations and sources, you bring your experiences, and we'll figure out the rest together. Strange Days on Spaced Out Radio. Come tune us in at spacedoutradio.com.
Want a place to share your experiences without feeling judged? We have the place for you. If you've experienced sightings or contact with ETs, ghosts, cryptids, or UFOs, and you'd like someone to confidentially look into the matter, just fill out an SOR Sightlines report. Our goal is to help you get the answers you need to the experiences you've had with our professional team of researchers. Your information stays 100% confidential. The SOR Sightlines report. Fill out your experience today only at spacedoutradio.com.
Psychic Sundays, spiritual communication, ET contact, Sasquatch in your backyard. We will have it all on Cosmic Passport with me, Elizabeth Anglin. Each Sunday, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, at spacedoutradio.com, I will take you on a journey of enlightenment. The goal is learning from the soul on out. We'd love it if you joined our experience. Cosmic Passport, heard Sundays at spacedoutradio.com.
Are you interested in advertising on Spaced Out Radio? Head to our website at spacedoutradio.com and click on our advertising tab. There, you will find an assortment of ways you can get your product out there with us, from radio commercials to banners and social media. Have a product you like our hosts to endorse? We can do that too. Visit spacedoutradio.com for more details.
From British Columbia to Northern California, Pacific North Weird has Cascadia covered. Check out our feature videos at spacedoutradio.com, where I, Vincent Zunza, and my super sleuth partner Alexandra Sullivan track down the weird and strange stories from around the Pacific Northwest, from Bigfoot to Mel's Hole and everything in between. This is what makes life exciting. So why report the normal when we can report the Pacific North Weird right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Don't have time to listen to Spaced Out Radio live? Wherever you are, the car, the office, the shower, or even if you're traveling, we're right here for you. Each Spaced Out Radio show can be found on iTunes, TuneIn, and on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. It's the perfect way for you to catch up on our shows. For more information, just head over to our website, spacedoutradio.com, and tune in to us today.
Welcome to Spaced Out Saturdays with me, Dave Cruz from Beyond the Strange. Our weekly feature on spacedoutradio.com will take you around the world discussing everything from the paranormal to the latest conspiracies from the top guests in their fields. We won't leave any story uncovered. Spaced Out Saturdays at spacedoutradio.com starting 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern.
The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. Would you like to connect with us? Head to spacedoutradio.com for all your latest show info. And hit us up on Twitter using the hashtag SpacedOutRadio. Now, back to Dave Scott and SOR.
Welcome back to hour number 2 of Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. Great to have you with us. Tomorrow night on the program, it's the final Friday of the month, which means it's time for the SOR Roundtable. We'll get all paranormal and weird on the events of the past month, and I hope you join us as well. We start at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time at spacedoutradio.com. We want to welcome in everyone listening in on WQEE 99 Rock the Key down in Noonan, Georgia, home of The Walking Dead. We are live as well on the United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM in New Orleans, and over 160 countries around the world. We're also live on KTLK, The Fringe FM, Renegade Talk Radio out of Las Vegas, and if you're listening in on and Revolution Radio. Remember, the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. Bill Cardwell has set the password for tonight in the SOR Space Travelers Club. Insouciance. Insouciance is your password. Make sure you use it wisely, Space Travelers, as Bill sets a password each and every night, right here on the mighty SOR. Now, if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so on Twitter, at Spaced Out Radio. Use the hashtag Spaced Out Radio if you want to connect with us live during the show as well. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You can also join the SOR Space Travelers Club if you want to chat live with the crew on Facebook. You can also give us a follow on Instagram, Dave Scott, SOR. We're on iHeartRadio in the United States, TalkStream Live. Tune us in on TuneIn and download and subscribe to our shows on iTunes. Our website is spacedoutradio.com, where we have a plethora of features for you, including joining the SOR Space Travelers Club for $5 a month. You can also rock out to some Bumblefoot. Read the encounter online. If you had an experience you can't explain, fill out an SOR Sightlines report. Watch UFO Seekers and Contact TV videos and so much more. Everything at spacedoutradio.com. Tonight we're talking about the Shroud of Turin. Our guest tonight is J.R. Watts. He is a former code breaker with the U.S. government. His website, shroudcodes.com. J.R., welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Dave.
Now, right before the break, we were breaking down how you believe that the shroud is actually that of Jesus Christ, and that the carbon dating is completely inaccurate because of where they tested on the shroud. If you want to continue with that, we can, or we can go on.
Well, not only that, not only being inaccurate, back then in 1988, the kind of testing, the kind of equipment that they had for carbon dating has since been replaced by far more advanced forms of carbon dating equipment. As a matter of fact, in 2010, sections of the shroud were carbon dated by an Italian physicist using advanced forms of carbon dating that make the 1988 carbon dating equipment look prehistoric. And in 2010, this physicist carbon dated the shroud, and he said that it dates to the 1st century, that the cloth dates to the 1st century. And I talk about that in my book briefly. These codes that I was able to crack about the shroud in the Bible, it's not something that was done overnight. I began the project in earnest in 2012, in early part of 2012. Right away, I began seeing what I believe to be linguistic codes about the shroud, in the words written by Paul the Apostle. It was what turned out to be a simple thing turned into a 5-year project for me. So between 2012 and 2016, this was a full-time job for me, 7 days a week. No one could have done this doing it part-time. It became a full-time thing. Initially, I had heard that there were codes and that there were spy clues in the New Testament about the shroud from a Reverend Albert Dreisbach of Atlanta, Georgia. And Dreisbach was a former U.S. naval officer who became a reverend. And I had a lot of phone conversations with him in 2000. And at that time, I had obtained life-size images of the Shroud of Turin from Barry Schwartz, well-known shroud researcher and photographer of the shroud and part of the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project that went to Italy with 40 American scientists and some European scientists. They were allowed access to the shroud for a whole week, and they did all kinds of tests on it. No tests that involved cutting the material or dissecting it, but they did a lot of tests and they brought with them $1 million worth of scientific equipment to test the shroud. And after more than a year, their conclusions were that this image on the shroud was really a mystery. They could not explain how the image of a crucified man got onto that cloth. The first thing they looked to see if it was paint. Was it a painting? They did different kinds of tests. No paint. There was one person who was indirectly connected to this group. He wasn't really part of their group. He didn't go to Italy with them. He didn't see the shroud firsthand. They gave him some sticky tape samples that they had pressed onto the shroud, and they lifted it up. And so the tape samples were able to trap particles, microscopic particles that were on the shroud. And they did that all over the shroud. So they had all these sticky tape samples, and they gave some of these to this chemist in Chicago, Walter McCrone. He did no chemical testing at all. All he did was look under the microscope. He looked at these tapes under a microscope, and he mistakenly thought he saw particles of paint. In fact, what he saw, and this was later proven by biologists and chemists, other chemists who did chemical testing, what he saw was blood, human blood, on those tape samples that were taken from the areas of the shroud where the blood was most prevalent on the body of Jesus, where he was crucified and whipped. There are more than 120 whip marks, wounds of scourging on Jesus' body, up and down the shroud, front and back. And that's another unique thing about the shroud, is that the shroud reproduced not just the frontal image of Jesus, but the rear image of Jesus as well, or the dorsal image. The front and back of his body from head to toe was replicated on the shroud. You have over 120 whip marks all over the body. The Romans used what they call a Roman flagrum. Flagrum was a whip with leather thongs attached at one end of it, several leather thongs, and attached to the end of those leather thongs were sharp bits of stone, sharp bits of glass, and metal. They were designed to rip flesh, to tear flesh apart. So crucified victims were first whipped, and my understanding is that the executors, the Roman soldiers, would also rub salt into the wounds to make it even more excruciating. Can you imagine being whipped almost to the point of death? I mean, where shock begins to set in, internal hemorrhaging up and down the body, and then you're having salt rubbed into your skin in those open, those torn and lacerated areas. Jesus spoke about, in the New Testament, we see several references to salt. And it could well be that these references to salt were a sublime form of shroud codes, in that they were trying to point to the fact that they knew that salt had been rubbed into the back, into the body of Jesus, and those whipping, those wounds that had been whipped and scourged. And then they crucified him. So I have one of the things I say in my book is that my book is a study in Scripture. It's a survey the silent interrogation of secret codes, symbolic of the shroud, wrapped up in the metaphors, such as the inward man and the outward man. And when Paul wrote that, the inward man and the outward man, these are shroud codes. He wrote that in one verse, in the space of one verse in 2 Corinthians. I believe it's in chapter 5 of 2 Corinthians or chapter 6. He wrote of the inward man and the outward man. He's talking about the image of Jesus. And so on the front cover of my book, you'll see these listed as some of the shroud codes. And you'll see 4 images, different images of the shroud on the front cover of my book that were taken of the shroud in various photographic perspectives. The spectral image is on the left side, upper left side of the front cover of the book. The inside or the interior, the invisible image of Jesus is seen on the right side of my book on the top. And so these are the codes: outward man, inward man. Now, John Jackson, Dr. John Jackson, a physicist, a former captain in the U.S. military, and I believe he worked on the Apollo moon mission back in the 1960s or 70s. He and some other physicists believe that the image of Jesus was actually replicated on the shroud through an act of fusion. We see, I've been able to discern shroud codes in the book of Daniel as well. Even Russ Brayall, who's a shroud researcher, has taken note of this, how the prophet Daniel, whose book, the book of Daniel, contains prophecies about the end of time, the end of days before the return of the Messiah. Daniel had recounted visions of a man in linen cloth standing on the water. Not in the water, but on the water, like Jesus walking on the water. And he wrote these references to a man in linen cloth very cryptically, along with a very strange combination of words, confusion of face. Now, granted, many people have been confused about these facial images of Jesus on the cloth. Why is there an image of Jesus on the cloth? How did that happen? Furthermore, how could there be two different images of Jesus on the cloth? One that looks like a shadow, one that looks like a mirror image, but in grayscale. Now, what I call a shroud code, confusion of face, by Daniel, the key word there in the word confusion would be fusion. The last 6 letters in the word confusion spell fusion. Fusion of face. Now, if you can't see that as a cryptic code, I don't know what you can. In the book of Ezekiel, in the Old Testament, as well, again, another example of the Old Testament shroud codes, in Ezekiel, I believe it's in chapter 1, he wrote of a shadowing shroud. Now, what do we see on the shroud? A shadowy image of Jesus. King David, in the Psalms, wrote a very cryptic shroud code. For no apparent reason, he wrote, "I will behold thy face when I awake with thy likeness." Now, in the context of the shroud and Jesus' image on the shroud, the Son of God, and even the disciples wrote that Jesus was the image of God. So when you see a verse like this, very cryptically, "I will behold thy face when I awake with thy likeness," I have to liken that to being a code about the shroud. Other codes that I see are the Lord Jesus was magnified. Well, what is an optical term, magnified? What is that doing in the New Testament? Well, because this is what we see on the shroud, the magnified image of Jesus. I mean, it's a holographic image of Jesus. It's a miraculous hologram. We see other shroud codes here in the New Testament. He appeared in another form. Well, that's true. He did. On the shroud, he appeared on the shroud multiple times, twice. Again, another shroud code is the hidden man. This would be the inward man, the invisible image of Jesus on the shroud. Again, we see another one, 2 men in shining garments, shroud code. Seek my face, shroud code. The unknown God, I'd liken it to be a code about the shroud. The man in linen cloth, filled with the Holy Ghost, the ghostly image of Jesus on the shroud. Paul's shroud codes were the most amazing. They were the most creative and ingenious. There is no historical record of any of the disciples ever coming into contact with the shroud because they couldn't afford to write about it. And so certainly you wouldn't see any documentation about Paul the Apostle, who didn't come onto the scene until much later, after the crucifixion and after the resurrection, when he started to persecute Christians and started having them arrested. He started arresting them. And he wrote many shroud codes where he even described what the shroud smelled like. When he wrote about the image of Jesus in Colossians, he wrote of the sweet-smelling savor. Now, savor, spelled S-A-V-O-U-R, means aroma or scent. But it also is a phonetic cipher for the word Savior, Jesus the Savior, the Messiah. But in the context of it smelling sweet, it's a shroud codes because John wrote, in the Gospel of John, he wrote that Mary Magdalene had anointed Jesus' body with 100 pounds of sweet-smelling spices that Joseph of Arimathea had purchased for the burial of Jesus. We see shroud codes, a figure, Paul wrote, a figure transferred. That's right. The bodily image of Jesus, his figure, was transferred onto the shroud. And like John Jackson says, likely through an act of fusion. We see codes like long-suffering. They use that a few times. Well, why would they even use the word long-suffering? Did it mean that Jesus suffered a long, long time on the cross? He was on the cross only 6 hours, which had to be a record minimum amount of time to die on the cross, because in those days it took about 3 days to die on the cross. Sometimes 2, if they were lucky, but oftentimes it was 3 days. Jesus died in 6 days. But then in Psalm 23, I think it's the end of Psalm 22 and the beginning of Psalm 23, when the end of Psalm 22, most of Psalm 22 is about the crucifixion of Jesus by David, but the end of Psalm 22 shows how God showed Jesus mercy by shortening his suffering. That's why he was only on the cross for 6 hours. So we see more shroud codes written by the disciples that say a shadow of the body of Christ. Now, what could that allude to? A shadow of the body of Christ. What could that allude to other than the ghostly image of Jesus on the shroud? We see codes like a linen cloth cast about his naked body. Now, this is a code found in Mark chapter 14 in the story of the Garden of Gethsemane during the arrest of Jesus. For some reason, Mark decided to write about a man who was one of their group who had a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And he ran naked from the Garden of Gethsemane that eventually was torn off. But why write about something as insignificant as that when Jesus is being arrested and dragged away? Why would he even write that? It's a code about the shroud, about the linen cloth on the naked body of Jesus, or the naked image of Jesus. See, again, the word cast has multiple, most of these shroud codes have multiple connotations, Dave, okay? Words that can have several references. Now, the word cast could mean thrown or shed. It could mean like a flashlight, illuminate, cast, C-A-S-T. So when Mark wrote a linen cloth cast about his naked body, some of these shroud codes needed to be reverse engineered. And so sometimes you look at these codes in reverse. Instead of looking at it as though it were written a linen cloth cast about his naked body, I looked at it in reverse. Naked body cast on the linen cloth. I'm like many other code breakers. Believe it or not, a lot of code breakers have dyslexia. Okay, and so you have to wonder how they ever get to be working for the government as code breakers. But they found out, especially in Britain, they found out that people with dyslexia, we don't walk around like Rain, like in the movie Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman, doing calculations in their head or spitting out dates or things like that. We look like the average person. We don't look like geeks. Everybody's different though. And some people, some code breakers have dyslexia to one degree or another, different degrees. And some of them specialize. I mean, they could do a Rubik's Cube with their eyes closed. I can't even do it. You know, if I had a Rubik's Cube in my hand for 10 years, I probably wouldn't be able to do it. But yet, the British government, their spy agencies, hired dozens of people who have dyslexia to work as code breakers in, I think, 2013 or 2014. That was on the internet that you could easily look up in the British newspapers. They have online versions of their newspapers online on their websites. Again, more shroud codes are with his stripes. We see this in Isaiah 53, with his stripes, meaning the whip marks or the marks of scourging on the body of Jesus. John wrote in his gospel, "Seek a proof of Christ, the print of the nails." Now, the word proof has different connotations. In the eyes of a photographer, you think of the word photo proof. What did we see on the shroud? The first photograph in history of Jesus, his image on the shroud. And in essence, it's a photograph of the Son of God, the Messiah, on a linen cloth. And Paul wrote, the shroud was a memorial before God. The word manifold, if you separate it into 3 syllables, break it up, man-I-fold, M-A-N-I, then F-O-L-D, what do you have there? You have a code about the shroud. Why? The shroud, whenever it was smuggled or whenever it was hidden, it was easily folded. What does the shroud have on it? The image of a man. And so we see the word man-I-fold numerous times in the New Testament, numerous times. And they could have easily substituted other words, but they selected words like that. Another word would be manifest. If you break up that word into 3 syllables, man-I-fest, F-E-S-T, man-I-fest, it was as though they rejoiced when they saw the image of Jesus on the shroud, as though they were having a festival. And I do believe that there were festive occasions when they brought this cloth out to convert people to Christianity. You have to ask, and I've always asked this, once Jesus was ascended to heaven and away from earth, how could Christianity have grown like it did? If the subject of that religion was no longer visible on earth, how did it grow so fast in the first century amid all that suffering and persecution and being thrown to the lions in the Roman Colosseum, and with the disciples being killed eventually one by one in various horrible ways? How did it grow, and why did it grow so fast the way it did in the first century? And because I believe that they had evidence of Jesus' divinity by seeing his image on the shroud. And I believe that the shroud was the New Testament's greatest secret, and the shroud codes in the New Testament is probably the second greatest secret. Now, the Bible tells us in the book of Acts that after the resurrection of Jesus, they still hadn't met the resurrected Jesus yet. The disciples didn't know what had happened. They only knew that the body was gone. Obviously, they knew about the shroud by then because Mary Magdalene and some other women had gone to the tomb of Jesus to finish the burial preparations after the Passover. They find that the large stone had been moved away from the entrance of the tomb, and they go in there and they see 2 men in shining garments. Now, it's written that these are angels, but it could also mean that the way that was written would to infer or allude to, in a cryptic way, the double image of Jesus on the shroud. But in any case, Mary Magdalene and a couple of other women were the first ones to discover the shroud. And in John, the book of John, he writes that Mary came to John and Peter, told them that the tomb was empty, and they ran. Now, John, when he wrote his gospel, didn't write it in the first person. Every other disciple wrote in the first person in their Gospels, but not John. He wrote it in the third person. Kind of strange. He even referred to himself in the third person throughout his Gospel. And I think he did that to avoid being persecuted, which might have been one of the reasons why he lived to be the longest, or the oldest age of all the disciples. He lived to be a very old man, although he was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he had visions of the end times, and he wrote Revelation. Actually, was dictated to him by Jesus Christ through the dimensions of time and space. So a lot of paranormal stuff was going on with Jesus and the disciples in the New Testament. You know, you do a radio show about paranormal events. There's more psychic phenomenon going on in the Bible than you could shake a stick at. More paranormal things going on in the Bible than in any Ray Bradbury novel.
You know what's funny is you mentioned that, JR, and I got into a debate just a few weeks ago with one of my Christian friends who was talking about how, you know, the difference that you shouldn't play with, you know, psychic prophecy and all that kind of stuff. It's evil. It's from the devil. And I said, well, there are very many people who are psychic, yet your Bible has a lot of speaking about prophets. I said, what's the difference? And it's amazing how many Christian people will get stumped on that.
You're right. In fact, Jeremiah and Elijah were called false prophets by the false prophets of their time. The gainsayers and the soothsayers. Today we know them as prosperity preachers on the televangelists we see on TV. The feel-good preachers, the rah-rah preachers. You know, they really are preaching the gospel of Tony Robbins and, you know, the self-help guru, infomercial king, more so than the gospel of Christ. I'm not going to mention any names as far as televangelists or you know, some of these guys out down there in the Bible Belt, but Jesus said many would come in his name in the last days, claiming to speak on his behalf, having the form of, you know, Christianity, but really denying its power. And I know Harold Camping from Family Radio, the guy who had predicted the end of the world on, what was it, May 21st, 2011. I used to listen to him a lot on the radio, what I detected in a lot of his statements was that he did not believe in the existence of Satan, the devil. He did not believe in that. He did not believe in the existence of demons, and he did not believe in the existence of hell. And this is what he said on the radio several times after 9/11. And I know that because I heard it with my own ears, and I couldn't believe what he was saying. But I actually met that man at a Family Radio luncheon in New York in 2000 and in 2001. And I think that he was suffering from a form of dementia that might have been undiagnosed, because he looked disoriented when I met him 9 years before he started making those end of world predictions. I met him twice during these luncheons, and he looked very forgetful. And he was saying a lot of contradictory things on the air, on his radio program. One day he would believe in something, and then the next week he would say he didn't believe in it. So who knows? But in any case, you talk about prophets of the Old Testament seeing visions, having experiencing psychic phenomenon. Daniel was a prime example. Moses was a prime example. Virtually all the prophets of the Old Testament, in one shape or another, had experienced visions and heard premonitions about events in the future and about things that were going on that they could not otherwise know, because back in the Bible days there was no form of communication other than the written word. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have TV or radio. And so a lot of these communiques from God, purportedly from God or from angels or archangels, that were given to the Old Testament prophets were indeed on a level of paranormal. I mean, what else are you going to call it? These are not normal things. But it just goes to underscore the fact, I said it before, the Bible originates from another dimension. The Bible says so. It says that it's inspired by the creator of the universe. And no other book, no other holy book, no other book of any other religion makes that same statement. And the Bible proves itself through prophecy, prophecies that are fulfilled long after the prophecies are written. You know, in 1997, go back to 1996, for some reason, I was drawn to the book of Daniel in that last chapter, chapter 12. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I kept on asking, what is this sealed book that Gabriel, the archangel, is referencing? The sealed book of prophecy, and that it's going to be sealed for ages and then be unsealed in the end of days. When Gabriel even alludes to Daniel being reincarnated or resurrected in some way to live in the last days. And even Jesus made a cryptic statement about the disciple John being alive in the last days. And the other disciples got jealous. They said, what do you mean? He's going to live between now and the time you come back? And Jesus said, no, I didn't say that. I just said, what is it to you if he's still around when I'm here? But I think it might have been a terrific reference that John himself might have been reincarnated in these end of days to maybe act as a prophet with Daniel. Who knows? They might end up being the two witnesses. I don't know. I can't say. A lot of people say the two witnesses are going to be Moses and Elijah because certain nicknames attributed to them in the Old Testament are referenced in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation. And I will tell you this, and no one else is, you won't hear this anywhere else. And this is something that God led me to decode a couple of years ago. In Revelation, the week that the two witnesses are killed by through the power of the devil, as they witness in the streets for God that these are the last days. But then they're killed. But they resurrect 3 days later. Has anybody ever told you the time of year that that's going to happen, or the week even of the year that that's going to happen? Let me give you a hint. That's going to happen around the time or the week that the people of the earth commonly make merry and send gifts to one another, meaning Christmas time. Now, Christmas was not even observed in the first century when Revelation was written. There's no records of Christmas being an established holiday in the first century. That didn't, from what I understand, that didn't come on until many ages later. And yet, John wrote, I think it's in Revelation 11:10, that the two witnesses would be killed and resurrect 3 days later. Their bodies would be laying in the streets of Jerusalem untouched because nobody would want to go near them. But in the meantime, all the people of the earth would rejoice and make merry and send gifts to one another. So John wouldn't have known about Christmas, so he wouldn't have known that at a future point in time, every December, toward the end of December, those things, those signs of the times would occur. So, and there's other things like I don't know if you want to stick on the shroud codes. My book, by the way, comes with 3D glasses because in my book, I have 2 full-page photographs of the Shroud of Turin in 3D, courtesy of Dr. Petrus Soons, who was a doctor from Panama, although I think he's from the Netherlands or somewhere around there. And he had obtained photographs from Barry Schwartz and had used some other photographs of the shroud that were taken in the 1930s. And he went to a specialized laboratory in the Dutch Netherlands, I believe, and made holographic photographs of the shroud. I think his website is shroud3d.com. And he gave me the permission to publish in my book 2 photographs of the shroud. One's a close-up of the face of Jesus on the shroud, and the other is the full-length body image of Jesus, the front of his body on the shroud, and it's in 3D. I mean, you could see the photographs without using the 3D glasses, but what I did was, with every book that sold of my book, I throw in a free pair of 3D glasses. They're cardboard glasses, but they do the job. You put them on, and the image of Jesus on the shroud just jumps off the page of the book. And it's actually animated. If you swivel in your chair or you tilt your head from left to right, the image of Jesus moves with you from side to side. If you angle your face a certain way, it's an amazing. These are an amazing set of photographs to look at, and they're worth the price alone. They're worth having. But aside from that, there are 77 photographs in my book, and most of them are in color. From the front cover to the rear cover and inside, you've got 77 photographs. There's more than 6 of them that are in color. And it's a full-size book. It's 8.5 by 11. It's a little over 300 pages. Actually, it's 2 books combined into one. It's 2 volumes combined into one. Originally, I had a book publisher who was going to publish the book for me, but she wanted to do it in 2 volumes, part 1 and part 2, because she saw what I did, that I literally found every code in the New Testament about the shroud, and I put it into a single volume, but it was actually 2 volumes. And then I added the shroud codes I found in the Old Testament. I put that in the book as well. And then in the first chapter of my book, I briefly recount the Twin Tower prophecies, the 9/11 visions, and the resurrection of the golden calf idol from Exodus 32, how it was the resurrection of the New York City New Millennium Cow Parade in 2000 and 2001. It wasn't really a parade, but they call it a cow parade. It was the outdoor public exhibition of 500 life-size cow and calf statues that looked surreal. They were designed and painted in the most exotic and surreal ways you could possibly imagine. And they were fixed all over New York City, on streets, sidewalks, parks, in front of buildings, schools. They even had some of them that were painted gold in front of churches, which to me, I mean, what could you provoke? If you want to provoke God, that's a good way to do it. Build a golden calf in the 21st century and put it in front of a church. If you go to the Exodus 32, Moses, when he first got the first set of 10 Commandments, was interrupted by God. And God said, listen, all the Hebrews that I freed from Egypt are down there in their camp at the base of the mountain, Mount Sinai. They're having an outdoor adoration of a golden calf idol that they built. They're acting as though they can contact me through that. It's like become a deity for them, a false idol. And God got so angry, he wanted to wipe them all out, do a genocide right there in Exodus 32. And Moses pleaded with him not to do that, to wait, so Moses could descend from the mountain and see what was going on and see if he could straighten out the problem himself, rather than see them all get killed. Because Moses said to God, then the Egyptians are going to laugh in my face. You went to all that trouble, God went to all that trouble to free them, just to kill them in the desert. So Moses descends Mount Sinai, and even before he sees the Jewish people dancing and celebrating and paying homage, some of them are actually throwing flower petals and flowers to this golden calf idol. Some of them look like they're praying. He heard them. They were singing and playing music in homage to this golden idol in the shape of a calf. So even before he saw them, he heard them. So it was a big, loud festival. By the time he saw them and got up close, he was more horrified, and he demanded that they destroy it and stop it, cease this false idolatry right away. And they refused. Let me tell you something. He wasn't going to stop there because God was going to wipe them all out. So he yelled out, who among all these people is still loyal to me? Where are my men? And the men from the tribe of Levi came to Moses' side. I guess there were a lot of them. And Moses said to them, I have a mission for you. Take out your swords and take out your knives. These people who built the cow, the golden calf, who contributed their gold to the building of it, and who are having this festival, I want them killed. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us everything that happened, moment by moment. There might have been a time, a couple of days or a week that might have went by where Moses wanted to separate the innocent from the guilty and just kill those who were mostly responsible for this golden calf, the ringleaders of this golden calf sin. But it's also possible that some innocent people got killed also in the process. But guess what? In Exodus chapter 32, it tells us Moses' men went in and out of their homes and their tents and killed all these people in connection with the golden calf sin. And 3,000 of these people died, were killed in one day. The same number of people who were killed on 9/11. Most of them in New York City, who at that time was filled with 500 of the same kind of idols like the golden calf. In fact, New York went beyond the golden calf idol. Some of those cow statues were designed and painted to mock Christianity. I think I show enough of them on my website and in my book to prove my point that what happened on 9/11 was connected in a sinister way, in a very strange way, to Exodus 32. 3,000 people got killed in the same day for false idolatry. God allowed them to be killed. And it's not to say that everybody in the Twin Towers deserved to die. No, I'm not saying that. But I will tell you this. Every cow and calf statue that was designed and painted for the cow parade for the new millennium in New York City cost $1,000 at least to paint and design. Who paid for that? Well, in large measure, companies that operated out of the World Trade Center paid for the construction of the cow parade idols. I'm talking about companies that had business offices in the Twin Towers and in Building Number 7 in the World Trade Center. These were stock brokerage companies, international banking companies, insurance firms, and various other kinds of businesses and agencies that did business in the Twin Towers. And unfortunately, sometimes when we see it in the Bible too, when judgment is pronounced on a nation or on a segment of the population, sometimes the innocent get killed with the guilty.
Very understandable.
And I'll tell you one thing else. 9/11, if you spelled it out alphabetically instead of numerically, you spell out 9/11 and compare it to the name of Nineveh, the ancient city that God sent Jonah to warn about, that he was going to destroy them for their sins. Nineveh is spelled almost exactly like 9/11 if you spelled out 9/11. Now, Moses, the Exodus 32 tells us that after those 3,000 people were killed in Moses' day, he went back up to Mount Sinai to get a second set of 10 Commandments because he accidentally broke the first set when he threw them down to the ground and the tablets cracked on the ground. So he had to get a new set. So the Bible tells us he went back up there and carved the second set himself. But he remembered the first set, everything that was written in the first set, so he didn't delineate, it was word for word, what God had written in the first set. When he came down off the mountain and presented that second set of 10 Commandments to the Jews, do you know what date that was? September 10th. Now, strangely enough, it's not written, it's not recorded in Exodus. It's not, in fact, you won't even find it in the Old Testament. However, this has always been part of Jewish tradition, that date, for centuries, ever since the time of Moses. And I'll tell you how they know this date for a fact. Well, they well remember only a couple of months earlier, 3,000 of their fellow Jews being murdered, by Moses' men. And when Moses got the Ten Commandments originally from God, he also got instructions from God about the festivals and feasts they should observe, the Jews should observe, and on what dates, not just days of the month and months of the year, but the dates, the 10th day of this or the 20th day of that. And so they were well aware of the calendar in their day, in Moses' time. They had a calendar with them. So when they left Egypt, they took a lot of things, and I'm sure one of them had to be a calendar. They wanted to keep track of time because they didn't know where they were going to end up. And the Jews were always excellent record keepers, okay? Always excellent record keepers. So now I ask you this, Dave. Can you get any closer to the date of September 11th than September 10th? So that's
Obviously
another strange
not.
connection.
We only got about 6 minutes here before we got to go to break here. I'm curious, when you were doing your research and looking at the Shroud codes, what Bible are you using?
I use several. I examine the Aramaic Bible.
Because in my opinion, sorry to cut you off there, in my opinion, you can't use the King James Version. That one's been edited way too much.
Which King James Version are you referencing?
The latest one that most churches use.
I wouldn't go near it. In fact, since the turn of the century, since the new millennium, they've come out with 2 or 3 revised versions of they call it the New King James Bible. It's so polluted and diluted and watered down. It's the work of the devil. My book, I did a survey of the Aramaic Bible, the General Bible. The General Bible predates even the Wycliffe Bible and the Tyndale Bible. I think the Tyndale Bible is also known as the Matthew Bible. Well, I went through all of them. I scoured through all of them, as well as the 1611 King James Bible. And the cross-referencing that I was able to do with the Shroud codes from Bible to Bible, I did not rely on any Bible from the 20th century or the 21st century or the 19th century. For the basis of my book, when I transposed the biblical text with the Shroud codes to my book, Shroud codes, I used the 1769 version of the King James Bible, and the only difference between that and the 1611 version of the King James Bible was that some of the words were some of the words by the 17th century, from 1611 to 1769, some of the words have been shortened or spelled differently. And the font style had in the 1611 King James Bible, they used what was known as Old English, the Old English style of writing. And so by 1769, they decided to update some of the words for the people who lived in the latter part of the 17th century. But if I would have took, in my opinion anyway, if I did my research with all those Bibles, a lot of people never even heard of the General Bible. And the General Bible, like I said, goes back to the 15th century. Right? So I think it was really the first English translation of the Old and New Testament. But for the purposes of my book, Shroud Codes in the Bible, to make it easier for the reader, I went by the 1611 and the 1769 King James Bible, but nothing beyond that. I'm a King James Bible believer, but like you, I've heard about these new versions of the King James Bible that they've come out with ever since the 21st century began, and I would tell anybody who has a Bible like that to get rid of it. Do not trust it. It's corrupted. Many Bibles out there are being used by televangelists, and these are corrupted texts. They're using, there's so many different versions of the Bible, you don't know what to go by. So I'd rather rely on the oldest known text that I have an easy time reading. And I don't see the reason why people don't even want to read the 1611 King James Bible. It's written around the time of Shakespeare. It's a beautiful language. If you're not going to understand that, listen. Today, Dave, we're living in the age of passwords, codes, usernames, secret codes. So it's no shock to me that now is the time for the shroud codes that have been deciphered. Hopefully this generation will be able to understand it, not just the baby boomers.
I understand that, but for a lot of people, though, they are going by what their church is telling them that they should read. And that can be a little bit dangerous, too. We got about 45 seconds with you, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, most of what you see on Christian cable TV these days is appalling. And I'm not going to name stations, or networks, but most of the broadcasting that I see is appalling. This would have never been allowed 50 years ago. The nonsense that's being pushed on TV today, they only want your money. They try and make you think that God's blessings cannot be had unless you give them your money continually. I mean, these people live in $10 million mansions. I mean, what does that tell you?
Oh, I fully agree with you. With you. Apparently,
you got televangelists who are making
millions.
They charge $15 a ticket if they speak at Yankee Stadium. $15 a ticket to go hear a man deliver a prosperity sermon.
I hear you. My friend, we're going to hold on right there. I mean, don't forget, Cleflo Dollar. God told him he needed a new Learjet for $65 million. So his church went and got him one. It's ridiculous. It's amazing the money that could have been saved by those people who probably really needed it more. We are going to get more into the Shroud of Turin. Your questions coming up. I know they're backed up. We will be getting to them in hour number 3, so you hold on. J.R. Watts is our guest tonight. His website is shroudcodes.com. Shroudcodes.com. His book is also Shroud Codes in the Bible. A Code Breaker Unlocks the Scripture's Secrets, proving the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott. We'll be back with more SOR and the Shroud of Turin right after our final break of the night.
We're getting strange on Saturday nights. Hi there, this is Dave Cruz, and each Saturday, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, I will take you on a tour of the weird and obtuse on Spaced Out Saturdays, from aliens to Sasquatch and every tinfoil hat in between. We got you covered. Join us at spacedoutradio.com for Spaced Out Saturdays. See you there.
Not ready for bed on Saturday night? Right after Spaced Out Saturdays, hop on over to S4 with Corey Ruiz and me, Eric Cooper from Forest Moon Paranormal. With S4, there are no limits to what we try and uncover. From government conspiracies to helping clean up the paranormal, no topic is safe on S4. We get to the heart of the matter, of the subjects you want to learn more about. So tune in on S4 starting at midnight Pacific, 3 a.m. Eastern, only on spacedoutradio.com.
Have you had an experience you can't explain? Would you like someone you can trust to look into it? We have just the place. The SOR Sightlines Report is the place for you to find answers. Whether it's Bigfoot, UFOs, Dogman, ghosts, aliens, or anything strange, the Sightlines Report will get you connected with one of our expert researchers to find out what's going on. All of your personal information is kept 100% confidential. The SOR Sightlines Report, a place for you to find the answers you need. Only at spacedoutradio.com.
Hi there. I'm Butch Witkowski, lead investigator with U4Cop. On the final Monday of every month, you can listen to me and host Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio's Strange Days. We're going to get to the heart of the matter when it comes to what's happening out there. People are seeing and experiencing things from ET contact to Bigfoot, and I want to hear about it. Your experiences are what we investigators need to help solve these unknown mysteries. So tune in at spacedoutradio.com to the final Monday of every month from Butch Witkowski's Strange Days.
This is Eric Markham, news editor for the Spaced Out Radio's The Encounter Online. We have put together a great team of writers and journalists from all over the world to bring you top-quality paranormal stories, from alien encounters to the latest conspiracies. You won't find any of that fake news here. True stories and top-notch reporting as we look to bring these experiences to the mainstream. The Encounter Online, only at spacedoutradio.com.
Do you want to know the truth? Do UFOs exist? Are aliens real? Are the governments hiding the biggest secret in history? We're UFO seekers, and we're on a hunt for the truth. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow along with us as we journey across the United States, visiting UFO hotspots and alien hotspots, trying to document the UFO phenomenon. Catch us on Spaced Out Radio every third Monday of the month as we discuss Area 51, UFOs, and more. And also, don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube.
Patrolling the Pacific Northwest, we are always on the lookout for the strange and unassuming stories that real people are experiencing. Hi, I'm Vincent Zunza from Pacific North Weird. Me and Alexandra Sullivan have teamed to bring to you those odd stories that never seem to make it into the mainstream. Stories so weird that will leave you scratching your head wondering, is this real? It's as real as it gets with Pacific North Weird. You can watch our videos right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Become more intimate and interactive with Spaced Out Radio. Join our Space Travelers Club with your new membership. For $5 a month, we'll provide you with special access to the website, monthly prize draws from books to psychic readings, along with monthly newsletter, private interviews, and more. Sign up today to be part of Spaced Out Radio's experience.
Looking for a place to advertise at a very reasonable cost? Look no further than Spaced Out Radio. SpacedOutRadio.com has an advertising tab that you can click to check out our daily, weekly, and monthly packages to play on the radio, or our website including social media. From commercial spots to banners, we have it all. Check out our competitive pricing today.
Don't have time to listen to Spaced Out Radio live? Wherever you are, the car, the office, the shower, or even if you're traveling, we're right here for you. Each Spaced Out Radio show can be found on iTunes, TuneIn, and on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. It's the perfect way for you to catch up on our shows. For more information, just head over to our website, spacedoutradio.com, and tune in to us today.
You hear footsteps in the empty room above you. A rocking chair begins rocking by itself. Don't be afraid of the things that go bump in the night. Reach for Spirit Storybox, the iPhone app the Huffington Post UK called the only ghost hunting app you will ever need. Spirit Storybox. The spirits are telling their stories. Are you listening?
Strange creatures lurking in the night, the sounds of wood knocking in the forest, odd happenings right out of a fictional world. These are the reports I love. Hi there, this is author Ronald Murphy, and I would love it if you join me and Spaced Out Radio host Dave Scott the second Wednesday of every month on our journey into the unknown land of cryptozoology at spacedoutradio.com. From Mothman to Frogman and everything in between. Hey, they don't call me the crypto guru for nothing.
It's Cosmic Sundays with me, Elizabeth Anglin, in Cosmic Passport. Let me take you down a 3-hour spiritual journey where we will get into everything from ET contact to Psychic Sundays. It's a journey of listening and learning together with some of the best professionals in their fields. You can tune in to Cosmic Passport at spacedoutradio.com every Sunday, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern.
The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio with Dave Scott. Follow Dave on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio and hashtag Spaced Out Radio, and on Facebook, Spaced Out Radio Show. Now, back to the program.
A child grew up too fast
Welcome back to the third and final hour of Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. Great to have you with us. Tomorrow night on the program, it's the final Friday of the month, which means it's time for the SOR Paranormal Roundtable. I'll bring in some friends, some great topics from the month that was, and we'll get going at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time at spacedoutradio.com. I hope you join us for that as well. We want to welcome in everyone listening in on WQEE 99 Rock the Key down in Noonan, Georgia, home of The Walking Dead. We are live as well on the United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM in New Orleans, at over 160 countries around the world. Great to have you with us as well. We are also live on KTLK, The Fringe FM, Renegade Talk Radio out of Las Vegas, and if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. Bill Cardwell has set the password for tonight in the SOR Space Travelers Club. I'm butchering it all of a sudden. Insuisense. There we go. Yeah, that's it. Bill sets a password each and every night, right here on the mighty SOR. Now, if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so on Twitter, at Spaced Out Radio. Use the hashtag Spaced Out Radio if you want to connect live with me during the show as well. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You could join us for a live chat on Facebook in the SOR Space Travelers group. We're also on Instagram, Dave Scott, SOR. You can listen to us on iHeartRadio in the United States, TalkStream Live, tune us in on TuneIn, and download and subscribe to our shows on iTunes. Our website is spacedoutradio.com, where we have a plethora of features for you, including joining the SOR Space Travelers Club for $5 a month. You can rock out to Bumblefoot. Shop at our Spaced Out Radio store. Watch some Contact TV or UFO Seekers videos, and so much more. Everything at spacedoutradio.com. For the final time tonight, I introduce J.R. Watts. His website is shroudcodes.com. We're talking about the Shroud of Turin tonight. You can also pick up his book, Shroud Codes in the Bible. A code breaker unlocks the... I got to try that again. Wow. A code breaker unlocks the scripture's secrets, proving the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. I apologize for that, JR. I got a little tongue-tied there. Well, great to have you with us, my friend. You've been fantastic tonight and going the distance, which we always appreciate you doing. I want to get to some audience questions right off the bat here. In the Spreaker chat room, Tripp is asking, Mr. Watts, what do you think of John 19, 39, and 40, Joseph, Arimathea, and Nicodemus prepared Jesus for burial, sprinkling 65 to 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes among linen strips, which is Jewish burial custom?
Okay, good question. Let me say this. I don't know if you remember, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, there was a movie that came out. It was called Risen. It was about the resurrection of Christ and a Roman centurion's effort to search for the body of Jesus that they suspected had been stolen by the disciples to make it look like he resurrected. And so this Roman centurion is going through these burial pits where they threw in the dead bodies of executed or crucified prisoners that they put on crosses and killed. And a lot of them are buried in shrouds in this pit. The bodies are covered in shrouds. Of course, they're not going to find the body of Jesus because he had resurrected. And they open up the shrouds and now, what were they going by? In the movie, the movie took the New Testament out of context. Roman centurion goes into the tomb of Jesus and finds the shroud with his image on it. Well, they mixed up the image. They show you the hidden image of Jesus that you really can't see with the naked eye, but that's the image that they portrayed on the shroud that the Roman centurion saw. So now he's got an idea what Jesus looked like. So that's when he decided, well, I'll find his body by remembering what the image looked like on the shroud, and I'll go into the pits for the executed criminals that we crucified, and I'll find his body, no doubt. Well, he never did. But the point of all this is that the Shroud of Turin is the only burial shroud in the history of the world that bears an image of a man on it. There have been millions of people in ancient times who died and were buried in burial shrouds, linen cloths. All right, and archaeologists have seen much evidence of these remains in tombs and whatnot, ancient graveyards, with skeletons and whatnot, covered in the remnants of shrouds. Most of them have withered away with time and the elements, but not one had ever bore an image of a person. Only the Shroud of Turin, the Shroud of Christ, has done that. As far as the spices, I believe the Bible recounted that they had about 100 pounds of spices, sweet-smelling spices, and ointments that they anointed the body of Jesus with. Whether or not they did the whole 100 pounds just before the Passover, or they had done some of it and they were going to go back and do the rest on the Monday morning, I don't know. But it's a fact. Joseph of Arimathea is one of the most interesting characters in the New Testament. He slips in the New Testament at a critical point in the life of Jesus. Actually, by that time, he's dead. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy attorney in the first century, and he was part of the religious political establishment, and no doubt part of their religious establishment as well as political. He was a man to be reckoned with. He had a lot of connections. He was part of the Sanhedrin. He did not have a hand in the trial of Jesus. He took no part in that. The Bible tells us he was a secret follower of Jesus, that he was a secret disciple of Jesus, that he believed that Jesus was the Messiah. He must have sought the evidence of the miracles and healings of the blind people and the deaf people and the crippled that Jesus healed. So the Bible tells us that Joseph purchased an expensive linen cloth for the burial of Jesus. The Bible tells us that Joseph of Arimathea bartered for the body of Jesus with Pontius Pilate. Some of the accounts say he begged the body of Jesus. Others say he bartered. Now, the word bartered means exchange. Bartered. That means he bribed Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate, being the good Italian governor that he was, a politician and a mafia chieftain, more or less, no doubt took money under the table and released the body of Jesus to Joseph of Arimathea. Otherwise, the body of Jesus was going to be buried in one of those pits that they put the bodies of executed victims in. You see images of the World War II concentration camps that were liberated, and they found pits filled with bodies of corpses of concentration. Well, this is something similar, okay? So, but fortunately, Joseph of Arimathea played that role, and he also provided a brand new tomb for the burial of Jesus. You go to, I believe, Isaiah 53, the role of Joseph of Arimathea was foretold by Isaiah in Isaiah 53, without naming Joseph as such, but really describing what he did. Isaiah wrote that after the suffering servant, meaning Jesus, was crucified, that he would be buried with the rich. He would be crucified with criminals, okay, like the thieves who hung on the crosses on either side of Jesus, but that he would, and yet, by contrast, Jesus would then be buried with the rich, meaning Joseph of Arimathea took custodianship of Jesus' body and brought it to a brand new tomb he had made especially for his own family, Joseph's family, and no body had ever been laid in there. Jesus was the first body. And they had wrapped his body in the shroud and anointed it with all those spices. It's an amazing thing that Isaiah. I want to tell you something. when I saw all those cow and calf idols in the New Millennium Cow Parade, I was an investigator working in New York City. My office was right across the street from the Twin Towers. I was right around the corner from them. I was at number 11 Park Place. As a matter of fact, a few years earlier, in 1995 or 1996, I worked for a government military contractor, and we worked on covert encryption communication technology for the government, various agencies of the government. And I also installed the new 9/11 emergency call center in New York City in 1996. So the number 9/11 seemed to be tugging at me as far as back as 1996. In 1999, I was working across the street from the World Trade Center. In 2000, the cow parade came, and I said, there's something going on. We're living in significant times. There's something wrong here with all these cow and calf idols. And at that time, I wasn't much of a Christian back then. I really wasn't. I considered myself a Christian, but I wasn't an angel. I wasn't perfect. And I made a mistake, and I'm going to reveal it here. I've been interviewed on radio before, but this is the first time I'm going to reveal it. I had, I mentioned this in chapter 1 of my book about the Shroud codes. Beginning early in the around February of 2001, I began to see visions of 9/11, 10 months before it happened, in my mind's eye. Over and over again, I would see jets that I sensed were hijacked, jets that crashed into both Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. And I would get premonitions giving me details about this upcoming or impending terror attack. Now, I knew that it would be that Islamic terrorists would be blamed for it, all right? That somehow or another they would have something to do with it. And it was very paranormal. It was like being propelled into the future, in a sense, that I could see the future, and but it was a horrible future, a horrendous future. And I didn't want to think about it. I worked right across the street from these buildings, from these towers. I would look outside my office window, and they were right there. Their shadow of the Twin Towers blocked the sun from ever coming into my office. We always had a shady office. You open up the windows, and there was nothing but shade coming in from the towers, from their shadows. But these visions they horrified me. They chased me around like a black cloud. And in the back of my mind, I'm hearing thoughts that say, warn the people who work at the Twin Towers, warn them that this is going to happen, that it's God's judgment, and look at all these cow statues around you in the city. And not only that, they had 2 cow statues at the World Trade Center between the 2 towers that were a combination of, they looked like, they had the bodies of the Twin Towers. They were small-scale replicas of the towers, about 30 feet high, 25 feet high, but they had the heads of cows on top of them, and the limbs, arms and legs of cows protruding from the sides of them and on the bottom. Not legs on the bottom, but they had hooves, the hooves of cows, protruding from the bottom on them, and they were standing on what looked like the footprints of the Twin Towers, what became known as the footprints after 9/11. And I said to myself, this is even more bizarre than the other cow and calf symbols I'm seeing. And I looked in Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy was written around the time of Exodus, of the book of Exodus, and we go back to chapter 32 of Exodus. But in Deuteronomy, Exodus 32 warned us against this kind of idolatry of idolizing statues of animals. But in Deuteronomy, God went further. He further condemned the statues of animals that stand up on 2 feet as though they were men. Because animals belong on 4 legs, for the most part. But in Deuteronomy, he further condemns that, God does. It's even worse than Exodus 32. And there it was before me in front of the Twin Towers. These 2 buildings that were 20 feet high, they were replicas of the Twin Towers, and I show a lot of pictures of them in my book about the Shroud codes in the Bible. And I show pictures of many of the exotic-looking cow and calf idols of the cow parade. They looked science fiction. They looked supernatural and paranormal. They didn't look like real cows or calves. Some of them were painted gold. They put them in front of Trinity Church, where the sycamore tree fell that Jonathan Kahn wrote about in The Harbinger, because the Trinity Church was part of St. Paul's Church, St. Peter's Church, which was a half a block away. But they shared a common graveyard that was connected between both of the churches. It was a 17th century graveyard on the grounds where the sycamore tree fell. It was right across the street from the Twin Towers, and the debris of 9/11 destroyed that sycamore tree, which was about 200 years old. It went back to the Revolutionary War. Now, I often wondered, why did I get those visions? Why was I haunted? I felt like Jonah and Nineveh. And like I said, I told you before, if you spell 9/11 out alphabetically and compare it with the name of Nineveh from the book of Jonah, they're spelled almost exactly alike. Now, I committed a stupid sin in 2000, the beginning of 2000, that when I did it, I didn't realize it was a sin. I was a fool. I had heard about the Bible Code, the Torah Code, the Bible Code, in 1997, and I read the book by Michael Drosnin about the Bible Code, and I got my own Bible Code software that I obtained from a software programmer, and a lot of code breakers use this type of technology to crack codes. At that time, now forgive me, I'm confessing something that I really need to say out to your audience, because they should realize why I had these visions of 9/11. I was looking for, I was trying to use this software for, search the Bible Code for lottery numbers. At that time, in the new millennium, New York State was the first time they entered the Powerball or the Mega Ball lotteries. So before that, they just had the New York State lottery. So in 2000, New Year's Eve, they were going to have the first Mega Ball or Powerball lottery ever in New York State. I think it was 6 or 7 states combined. They had like an $80 million Powerball. Now, originally I got the Bible Code software to look for codes about the Shroud in 2000, because that's what I was really, that's why I was really interested in the Bible Code, to see if I could find codes about the Shroud in ELS form, ELS codes, which means equidistant letter sequence codes, the interval skipping of letters, that spell out names and places and events. But, I was tempted, whether by my own stupidity and secularism, because, sometimes Christians can be secular too and materialistic. We all want to be wealthy. We all want to have the security that wealth provides. And I made the foolish mistake of thinking that I'd be able to find winning lottery numbers in the Bible by using the Bible Code software. I mean, I may not have been the only one to do that, but I was a fool for doing that. I didn't realize it at the time. Now, of course, I didn't find the winning lottery numbers. You're never going to find winning lottery numbers that way. I came to learn. But within 2 weeks, I was in a car accident. I was assaulted by somebody. It put me out of work for a month with injuries. Bad things began to happen to me in the start of 2000. And I realized that I should have never had tried to do that with the Bible Code software. Never. It was a grievous sin to God. I didn't even think I was on God's radar. I didn't even think he was aware of me. But yet he was. He's aware of all of us. And within a year, I would begin to have the Twin Tower prophecies, the 9/11 visions and premonitions, because I didn't realize at first I was being punished by God. And that's the way I look at it. You see, when I wanted to try and search for winning lottery numbers, Dave, in the Bible Code, I was trying to look into the future. It was like a form of divination. And that's a sin. And to try and use the Bible to do that for material gain like that, it's even a worse sin, okay? Now, within a year, I'm being haunted by visions of the future regarding the Twin Tower attacks on September 11th. So I came to realize after the fact, after 9/11, that in a sense, I was punished by God by continually receiving these messages on a telepathic level about the 9/11 attacks. It was like a curse. And I knew many people who died in the Twin Towers. And I straightened out since then. But it was a learning process. I was young and foolish at the time, a long time ago. And I just want people to be aware that things happen for a reason. And it took me a long time to realize that that might have been one of the reasons why. Now, as far as the shroud codes are concerned, I had a friend of mine who works as a code breaker also, and at the time I began my research in 2012 with the shroud codes, because a dozen years went by before I picked up the trail of the shroud codes again. A dozen years went by, and after 9/11, before I would even begin to decode the Bible for possible clues and hints about the shroud. And a good friend of mine who still worked at the National Security Agency offered to help me. And he has access to all kinds of technology. I worked for different agencies of the government as well. But he basically verified what I had found in the Bible. He said, show me the data sets that you have, and data sets are basically collections of related sets of information or data that are composed of separate elements, or it could be, a variety of codes or hints or clues about something that will correlate into what might be a network that points to a particular thing or subject. In this case, it turned out to be the image of Jesus on the shroud. There were prophets in the Bible, in the Old Testament, who also committed wrong, who did sins, and they were punished by God. And yet, he found it in his heart to forgive them and to help them later on in their lives, as long as they straightened out. And this is what I felt happened with me. I learned my lesson with 9/11 and the cow parade. And let me tell you something, Dave. When 9/11 did happen, I wasn't in New York City at the time. I was still home. I lived on Staten Island. I lived about 25 miles from downtown Manhattan. And I was very late leaving my home on the morning of 9/11. Some of the last prophecies I received, or visions, premonitions about the Twin Tower attacks, happened in the days right before it. The Saturday night, I think it was September 8th, 2001, Saturday night before 9/11, I was stopped at a red light by the North Tower of the World Trade Center. I happened to be in the city that Saturday night and stopped at this long light. It seemed to take forever to turn green. It had to be like close to 10 minutes. I knew something was wrong. And all this time I'm hearing in my mind, do you see these towers I've been warning you about these last 10 months? I've warned you about the danger to come, and yet you turn your back on me like Jonah, and you want to warn these people? It's going to happen. Between this Saturday night and next Saturday night, these towers won't be standing. You had a chance to warn people, and you didn't. And you're going to regret it the rest of your life. And you'll cry about it many times, which I did. And as soon as that light turned green, I got at it. I stepped on the gas, and I got at it. I got out of Manhattan. It was chasing me, these prophecies. And then 2 days later, the Monday, September 10th, before 9/11, 24 hours before 9/11, when I woke up that morning, a verse from the book of Revelation haunted me the whole day before 9/11. It was about the rider on the pale horse, whose name was Death, and hell follows with him. And I knew it had something to do with the World Trade Center and my visions of 9/11. Although I didn't know anything about the number of 9/11. I didn't correlate that it would, when I got that prophecy that it would happen between September 8th and September 15th, between this Saturday and the next Saturday night, I should have looked on the map and looked at the dates of the week and looked at the 11th day and realized that we were in the 9th month and it was going to be the 11th day. That would have been the emergency code that I installed personally with a team of technicians for New York City's police department, the 9/11. So it didn't dawn on me because I kept on trying to push these visions and prophecies out of my mind. I ran away from them like Jonah tried to run away from his mission of trying to warn the people of Nineveh. And I didn't warn the people who were going to be involved in 9/11, and thousands of them died. I don't know whether or not I would have changed anything by warning them, but I was a coward, So I sensed that these premonitions and visions were coming from God, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that he would allow thousands to be people to be killed with hijacked jets crashing into their office towers. They didn't want to believe it. And when I opened up my Bible the day before 9/11 and to Revelation, and I look it up to see where the rider on the pale horse, he's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And wherever he rode in that prophecy in Revelation, mass murder ensued. But the rider on the pale horse, whose name was Death, his horse was riding in the sky. If you read that text in the King James Bible, for instance, he's riding in the sky, in the air. This is a spiritual horse. It's not a physical horse that's riding on the ground out of a stable somewhere. This is a supernatural horse, a spiritual specter of a horse with the Grim Reaper riding him. And wherever they ride, mass murder follow on the earth, underneath, below them. And I sensed that this had to do with the Twin Tower prophecies that I was having. And I said, no, these are not prophecies. This is my imagination running away with me. There's something wrong. I've never had visions before. I've never had premonitions before. Why? I don't even like disaster movies. Why would I even want to think about this stuff? But I even knew the name of the airlines that would be hijacked: American Airlines and United Airlines. I knew that because I felt that God was warning me about this, that he wanted me to know and tell people. And I asked why. Why United and why American? And he said, those names of those airlines best represent the name of your nation, the United States of America.
9/11 is always a very touchy subject around here, so I'm going to start switching it back to the Shroud, if you don't mind, for a few more questions, because we only got about 20 minutes left with you, or 25 minutes. Why do you think, if the big study that was done in 1978, and the main scientists who researched the Shroud on that date basically came with one conclusion, that this was the Shroud of Jesus Christ, why do you think the Catholic Church neither confirms or denies whether it is or not? Is this all part of the Vatican game where they like to tease people with information?
You know what? I have heard their statements for decades, since the 1980s. I never trusted them when they allowed it to be carbon dated. It seemed like a crime that they would cut away a piece of that cloth. But it wasn't even, let's put it this way. Everything the Vatican has said sounds like they have passed the buck. In other words, God forbid they stick their necks out and take a stand on something, even if they believe in it, they're afraid to say so. And so you ask, what's going on underneath the surface? What's going on in the minds of these high officials in the Vatican? You see, what I did with the Shroud codes, if anybody had done this in the Middle Ages, they would have been burnt at the stake. All right, because they would have branded me as being a heretic. All right, they tried to burn William Tyndale at the stake for translating the Bible into English. Okay. And other people in the Middle Ages who tried to translate the Bible to their language, they exiled or they killed or they harassed. God forbid anyone would have looked through the Bible and wrote a book like I did, Shroud Codes in the Bible, they would have been burnt at the stake. So I was fortunate to live in an age at a time in the 21st century. I'm almost 60 years old now, so I'm not a spring chicken. I've been around. I don't think some young kid could have done what I did. I think it would have took somebody who had decades of experience as a code breaker, an investigator, and who had a Christian mindset. Granted, early on in my Christian life, I was backsliding, I still don't think I'm the perfect Christian, but I don't think anybody is. But the Vatican, first of all, in 2002, the Vatican had the Shroud. They did a restoration effort on the Shroud, and according to a lot of well-known Shroud experts like Barry Schwartz and Dr. John Jackson, they did more damage to the shroud than good. They vacuumed it. Can you imagine that? They vacuumed the shroud. They virtually bleached it almost to a different shade. It's not quite the same tan color it was. They actually made it lighter in color. It's harder to see the image of Jesus on the shroud now as a result of what they did. And they should have consulted Dr. John Jackson more than anybody else, because he would have told them the best way to do a restoration process on the shroud. And instead, they relied on some woman who had experience in textiles, but, she wasn't a scientist. The scientists of the Shroud of Turin Research Project from 1978, it really was their efforts that inspired me also to write this book about the shroud codes. Dr. John Jackson gave me a lot of encouragement. Dr. Petrossoon, Dr. Manuel Marinelli, who's an Italian scientist who's a shroud researcher, and Barry Schwartz. I often tell Barry Schwartz, Barry, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have written this book. He says, why? I said, because really, I've spoken to you on the phone a million times and met you twice, and you were, the Delphi Oracle of shroud information for me. And anytime I had a question, Barry would spend an hour and a half with me on the phone with no problem. He was very generous with his time and the information he gave me. So, just talking to Barry was a college education in the shroud. But, Barry's not a code breaker. The first time I told Barry I suspected there were shroud codes in the Bible in 2000, before the cow parade interrupted my hunt for the codes, Barry didn't believe it. He said, come on, Johnny, there's no such thing as secret codes in the Bible. I said, Barry, you're wrong. There is. Have you ever heard of the Bible code? And he didn't. He didn't know anything about it. Even though the Bible code was the best-selling book in 1997, and it was based on legitimate research by Professor Rips in Israel, and some other code breakers from Israel who proved that secret codes have existed in the Old Testament, primarily in the 5 books of Moses, first 5 books of the Old Testament. Oh, by the way, a lot of the code breakers in Israel, and some of them I've been in communication with, they're Jewish, they're Orthodox Jews. Many of them, they don't publicly believe in Jesus. And so they say, they denounce anybody who thinks that there's secret codes in the rest of the Old Testament. They say, no, it's only in the Torah that there are secret codes about the future, about future events. 9/11 was encoded in detail in the book of Leviticus. Now, one of the things I did, there's so much happening that I can't remember everything to tell you unless I write it down in like a script. But one of the things I had with my Bible code software, after that fiasco with the lottery numbers, I put it away for a while. But when I started getting those visions of the Twin Tower attacks, I took out the Bible code software. I had 2 different CD-ROMs. One was called Code Finder, New Millennium Code Finder, and the other one was called Unlocking the Bible Codes. And they were both good software programs to hunt for codes in the Bible. So I started forming a list of words that might be related to the Twin Tower attacks. And I started finding them. The words Twin Towers, plane, airplane, attack. But I didn't know what month it would happen in or what year. And and I was so busy. I was working 2 jobs at the time. Anyhow, I had just gotten married. So I was distracted on a lot of levels. But the Israeli code breakers say there's no such thing as Torah codes or Bible codes in the rest of the Old Testament, because they know there are codes about Jesus and his divinity, his being the Messiah. There are codes, especially in Isaiah 53. There are codes about Jesus that are written as a ciphertext. It's like a cryptogram. It could easily be revealed by having Bible code software. Nowadays, you download it from a website, wherever you buy it from. They don't cost that much. It's a few bucks. But They don't want anyone to think that there are ELS codes in the rest of the Old Testament beyond the Torah, but there are. In fact, in the book of Jonah, the part where Jonah is swallowed by the great fish, it's never described as a whale, or not named as a whale, just as a great fish that swallows Jonah. Well, I searched for the word whale as a possible ELS code, equidistant letter code, in the interval skipping of letters in that particular book of the Bible. And the book of Jonah is only a page and a half long. It's 4 short chapters, and yet it's an amazing story. I found the word whale encoded. It intersects the verse where Jonah is swallowed by the great fish. And anybody listening to my voice right now who might have Bible code software, do a search in the book of Jonah for the word whale, and you'll find it exactly where I did, right where he's swallowed by the great fish. And all right, so that's one example of a code in a book that only has 4 short chapters. So on a statistical level, that adds credibility to the fact that this is a bona fide code. And about what? The type of fish that swallowed Jonah, a whale. And I've emailed this to Rabbi Glazerson, who has a YouTube channel. He's got a lot of great videos of Torah code discoveries that he finds on a daily basis in relation to modern day events being coded in the Torah. But he stays in the Torah only. He doesn't venture out into the Psalms or into Isaiah or Ezekiel. And I wish he did, but they want us to believe that there are no other codes in the rest of the Old Testament, but there are. Because there's a pattern of codes that reveal Jesus as the Messiah in the rest of the Old Testament in the ELS codes. So it's an amazing thing. Listen, Dave, we all make mistakes. And the thing is, you fall off a horse, you get back on it, you correct your mistakes, and you move on, you go on. Hopefully you don't do the same mistakes. And hopefully God will give you the guidance and inspiration that you ask Him for, that you pray for. I know I prayed a great deal when I first decided to pick up the Shroud Code hunt again in 2012. And, within the matter of weeks and months, what we realized, me and my friends from the National Security Agency, was that for 2,000 years, especially in the New Testament, for 2,000 years, they were veiled patterns that were codes by design, not by accident, by design. No other hypothesis meets the facts. This was the case. To me, it's the most significant discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible code, these Shroud codes. They not only prove that the disciples of Jesus were aware of the Shroud, the Shroud codes prove that they were in possession of the Shroud secretly, and that they smuggled it here and there, and they had safe houses for the Shroud, and sometimes their friends and family members safeguarded the Shroud for them because they were always under the eyes of the Sanhedrin and the Jewish high priests. But this is a case of subterfuge and clandestine goings-on. It's a deception of perception, I like to say, an illusion. These codes have they tricked our perception. We haven't realized these are encryptions. They're embedded in the New Testament. They're like interchangeable permutations. It's a hidden trail within the broader context of the New Testament. These codes, I say it on by the way, my book was the best-selling book on the website for prophecyinthenews.com. Prophecy in the News was a ministry started by J.R. Church, and that was, it's still around. It was around for a long time. They have a YouTube channel and a monthly magazine. And they, in June and July, I wrote 2 articles for their magazine about the Shroud codes in the Bible for Prophecy in the News, which you could actually obtain from their website if you want. And it was a 2-part article that I wrote. And if you go onto my Amazon page for my book, Shroud Codes in the Bible, and if you scroll down below the book description, you scroll down, you'll see I have a review by Dr. Kenneth Stevenson, who was he was a member of the Shroud of Turin Research Project in 1978. And if you scroll down even further, you'll see a picture of me with a biography of me and how I got involved in this. One of the things that I like to stay in the intelligence field. I'm a member of the Pattern Recognition Society. I'm a member of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. I belong to the American Cryptogram Association, and I'm also affiliated with the National Security Agency's National Museum in Maryland, and I'm a member of the International Association for Cryptologic Research. And these are great organizations to be affiliated with because they keep me in the flow of things. I always keep my hands in this. If you click on to where it says visit Amazon's J.R. Watts' page above my photograph, if you click onto that, more about the author, you'll see illustrations of the disciples of Jesus writing their shroud codes, or let's put it this way, representations of what they would have looked like as they wrote the New Testament, at the same time using the New Testament as a secret code book for the shroud codes, while at the same time maintaining the gospel messages. So I want people to realize that just because there's a network of hidden codes about the shroud in the New Testament, that does not change the gospel of Christ at all. It doesn't change the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. It doesn't change any of the epistles of Paul. They only confirm them and enhance them. I got some nice pictures of what the disciples would have looked like as they reflected on the shroud, as they wrote the New Testament. And so they wrote the New Testament on two levels, to recount the life of Jesus and his resurrection, but also to infiltrate their Gospels with shroud codes, pepper their Gospels with clues and hints about the shroud, about the image of Jesus. I would love to get on one of the, Christian broadcasting TV shows to talk about this, but no one has invited me. They're too busy talking about the prosperity gospel.
I get that. Let's get to some more questions from our audience because they are piling up here and we are running out of time. Jamie is asking, what was the shroud made of? Was it Egyptian cotton?
It was the shroud. From what I understand, it was a combination of cotton and flax. At some point, I think it's, let me see. If you go on, Barry's got a great website, shroud.com. Depending on what website you read, they're flax fibers with traces of cotton. And that's on Barry's own website, shroud.com. All you have to do is type in shroud and the word cotton and the word flax, and one of the first websites that will come up will be a PDF article from Barry's website about what the shroud is made of. Now, the patches that were sewn on in the shroud after the fire in France in 1532, 2 years later they sewed on the new patches of cloth. That was all cotton, okay? So when we see a parable of Jesus about warning us against sewing on patches of new cloth on a damaged clothing or a damaged linen cloth because they wouldn't blend right or wouldn't mesh right, as a code breaker and someone who knows a lot about the shroud, you know that he wasn't just giving tips on upholstery, that these disciples, these guys, very cunningly, someone, maybe Joseph of Arimathea, maybe. Oh, by the way, I meant to tell you before, when Jesus was on, when the two disciples, I don't think the Acts tells us which disciples, but two of the disciples were on the road to Emmaus, wondering about what had happened after the disappearance of Jesus' body, and they were approached by a stranger who actually turned out to be Jesus in disguise after the resurrection. And then they said, don't you know what happened in Jerusalem? Haven't you heard the commotion about Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, how we thought he was the Son of God? And Jesus, in his disguised form, opened up the Old Testament scriptures to them, revealing to them the codes of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, crucifixion, how they were encoded in the Old Testament. And they are written in a similar way to the Shroud codes. They're blended in the different accounts in the Old Testament. They pop up out of, in other words, they might be in one paragraph in any Old Testament book, but the paragraph above it and the paragraph below it may not have anything to do with that prophecy, and yet these are prophecies about Jesus. So that might have been the beginning of their learning process of how to write secret codes.
Was he buried much like the Jews and the Egyptians used to bury people, or was it something different for him?
Well, they placed his body in the tomb. They couldn't have a formal funeral because the Passover was, right on the horizon there. The other thing was, when he was crucified and he died, there was some sort of eclipse. The Bible tells us the sun darkened for several hours, some kind of supernatural eclipse. But when they brought his body to the tomb, they anointed it with the spices, they laid it on the shroud, and then they covered the body totally in the shroud, from head to foot, back in the rear and the front of the body, the back of the body. So now it's all anointed with the spices. And during that 3-day period, at some point, Dr. John Jackson believes the body of Jesus disintegrated like a vapor and went right through the shroud, imprinting Jesus' bodily form on the shroud and during the resurrection. And if you go on YouTube, you'll see Dr. John Jackson talking about this on documentaries about the shroud. You know, the amazing thing is, the shroud is probably the #1 subject for documentaries on YouTube. It's amazing. Go on YouTube and just type in Shroud of Turin. You'll see dozens of TV shows. I'm hoping that the History Channel will come and talk to me about the Shroud codes. I'd like to get it out there in the mass media, should do a documentary, If someone could do a documentary about the Shroud codes, I think a dramatic film should be made based on the book about the Shroud codes, because this would give modern-day Christians a new perspective on the lives of the disciples in the early days of the Christian church, as they wrote the Gospels and wrote the Shroud codes at the same time, and showed the shroud in secrecy to new believers, converting them into the faith of Christ. And I also believe that the Shroud codes have told us that the shroud had healing power, that people who were injured or had illnesses, if they came into contact with the shroud, were healed. In fact, even Barry Schwartz alludes to this, and Russ Brayol, who's a shroud researcher, with the story about a king from the city of Odessa, Agar, I think his name is, or Abgar, who has a serious illness, and they bring a piece of cloth to him, supposedly that Jesus sent, and the king is healed right away when he was at death's door. That's on Barry Schwartz's website, shroud.com. If you go on shroudcodes.com, you won't. My website has a lot of information, but I didn't have the room to show the Shroud codes. I realized I had to write a book. There was no way I could fit all this on one website. I just didn't have that amount of space in my website. But there's a lot of interesting stuff about Bible prophecy in my website, and the Cow Parade, and the New Millennium, and the Nineveh, and Golden Calf, and the Shroud codes, and whatnot. I don't know how you can compare ancient burial customs between Egyptians and Jews. They had, sometimes they made mummies out of people in Egypt. The Jews, I don't think, did that. They buried people as quickly as they could. They still do, So, but on my website, almost at the top of the page, you'll see where it says, I reference John 20, verses 5 through 8, and I highlight and I underline key codes about the shroud. Linen cloths, 3 times in 3 consecutive verses. John keeps on referencing the linen cloths that he and Peter found in the tomb. Why would he keep on repetitively point to the linen cloths 3 straight times in 3 straight sentences unless he were purposely trying to bring it to our attention? All right? Our attention and the attention of the early Christians in the first century. The New Testament is the New Testament. The Gospels are the Gospels. But thank God they wrote the Shroud codes in these Gospels in a secretive way. My book shows you where they are, how they fit into the Gospel narrative, and how I was able to decipher them by separating them from the words around them, which act as a bridge to bridge the gap between the Shroud codes. There are a ton of Shroud codes in the New Testament. It is a network. Sometimes it's subtle nuances in the syntax of language that you see in the Bible, but sometimes it's just out and out. Hey, this is a Shroud code. Some of Paul's codes were like in your face. And a lot of the Shroud codes were associated with patterns of data connected with the visual sense of sight. Why is that? Because the shroud is a visual image. It's a mystical image of Jesus on a linen cloth with no scientific way of proving how that image got on there. So it's not paint. Even Paul says in his Shroud codes in 2 Corinthians, it's not by ink. And this is not something that was engraved onto the shroud. It wasn't carved onto the shroud. It was not something that was burned onto the shroud. It wasn't drawn on the shroud. This was not their doing. It was the power of God that created the image of Christ on the shroud. So when you read my book, you'll understand that, and you'll see the New Testament in a different light, but in a way that you could better appreciate the New Testament. The Shroud codes don't conflict with the New Testament. They confirm it. They're part and parcel of the New Testament. They had to be blended into the New Testament. Where else would you put codes about the Shroud of Jesus? Where else? You wouldn't put it in the Quran. You wouldn't put it in, you wouldn't put it in any other book but the New Testament. But like I said, it would take a code breaker who had a belief in Jesus and who had researched the Shroud to see this. But it took a lot of work. Let me tell you, it was the hardest thing I ever did in my life, searching for these codes and then connecting them, cross-referencing them. And my friend at the NSA, God bless his soul, he told me he didn't want me to mention him in my book because when he was helping me out, it was around the time of the Edwin Snowden scandal at the NSA. And plus the fact my friend was Jewish and he had a rabbi for an uncle and came from an Orthodox family. But, he was open-minded about Jesus. So when he heard of my research, he offered to help me. And he basically confirmed what I had already found.
My friend,
data set that I have found.
I got to wrap this up. Tell people where they can find your book.
You could get the book, probably the cheapest place is on shroudcodes.com. If you have a PayPal account, it's the cheapest price. You can get it on amazon.com. You can get it on the website for Prophecy in the News. They actually bought 8 cases of my books. They were selling out before they even ordered my cases. They put my book up for sale in June. They ordered 1 case, and they told me they needed another case, and they called me back. We need 2 more cases and 3 more. Yeah, it was the best-selling book on their website for Prophecy in the News all summer long and now into the fall, which I thank God.
I gotta cut it there, my friend. J.R. Watts, Thank you so much for being on Spaced Out Radio tonight. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
If you're listening in the background, you got Ron Bumblefoot Thal's Little Brother is Watching. Bumblefoot, the official music of Spaced Out Radio, rocks us in and out of every single show. Tomorrow night on the program, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time, I'm going to bring the panel of friends in. We're going to have the SOR Roundtable. We do it the final Friday of every month, talking all things paranormal. I hope you stick around and join us as well. Your questions are warranted for that one. I want to thank members of my team for helping me put this together, and everyone out in the listening land. You guys are sharing the show. You're chatting away in Spreaker, on Facebook, Revolution Radio, on Twitter, and hashtag Spaced Out Radio. You're sharing our program, telling other people all about it. I got to tell you, I'm appreciative of that, because together, my friends, we own the night. We'll talk to you in 21 hours from now. Mr. Bumblefoot, we need a favor. We need you to take us home. Have a good one. Good night.